Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Mike Buhl.
Mhm.
And Mike, welcome to the
Yes.
podcast.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so you wanted to talk about an article that was written by a French theorist, French
Oh,
sociologist.
theology. Yeah.
Uh,
University of Paris.
yeah, Dujarrier, I think,
Yes.
was the name.
First name Marie Anne. Um, Article particularly was published in the journal CCC, and it is an open access article, so there's no paywall. But this is a translation of her recent book on the notion of work. The title of the article is, quote, How Work as a Category of Thought Has Been Disrupted in Neoliberal Capitalist Societies, right? It's actually just published uh, this year, and this is a recent publication. But uh, I found it fascinating, to be honest. It has different takeaways, not just philosophical, but also sociological takeaways of how we conceptualize the idea of work. And there were some things in there that I even had difficulty, accepting at first, but including whether or not non-human labor, like animals, should be counted as a kind of work, or in the future, robots and the kind of work that robots are doing for us should be also counted as work, and so there's a variety of directions that this author is taking, but just challenging the way we think about work and the way we frame the idea of work, especially in the 21st century. And yeah, so it's quite fascinating from that standpoint. New ideas. Not to say that those ideas haven't been said before. I mean, people have always theorized, discussed about work and what direction it's going, including Jeremy Rifkin. Um, I think his book was titled "The End of Work." It has a kind of pessimistic outlook, and that unemployment will become a reality in the 21st century. Um, and there are some people that have an optimistic view. They think, well, work is just going to be transformed. We'll always have work, but it will just be transformed in the future, right? And then there's a kind of Ulrich Beck criticism. The Brave New World of Work is a kind of dystopian view of work, right? So I I think it's a great topic, especially for many of us who work in jobs, that may or may not become obsolete with AI, right? And what prospects, what will happen in the future, right? That's just my takeaway. But for the most part, the reason why I really enjoyed reading this article, which I recommend it, hopefully we'll add a link to our listeners for those that like to read it.
Cool.
Um, yeah, there's just so many different ways to think about working. Uh, it's transformation, realistic transformation of it, and what consequences this transformation has for us, right? So that's my little intro.
Yeah, so
There.
regarding Rifkin, I think
Yeah.
that there is a more recent iteration
uh
of that argument by another guy named Suskind.
Okay.
I think Daniel Suskind. There's a father named Richard Suskind, and he talks about the automation of law and the legal profession.
Oh, wow.
And then the son, Daniel Suskind, is an economist in Oxford,
Hmm.
and and he talks about this concept of encroachment,
Hmm.
which is the idea that as the technologies get better, they take on more and more of the human tasks. So that's the encroachment. And because it's kind of a continuum, a gradual process, right? So that you might not see a complete elimination of jobs, at least not in the short term. But I mean, but what you would have to do is, let's say you take the average job and then you have to break down all of the tasks that are going into that job, right? So if you're a secretary, it is not just about typing. Typing is a very specific kind of skill,
Mhm.
but it's also about filing a paperwork, right? Like if you have you know a bureaucratic expectation, right? Can you take that action, right? Can you follow up with coworkers who have to fill out paperwork and things like that? So that is yeah, and so all of these occupational tasks, like let's say if you have one occupation where there's like 100 unique tasks that are respective to that job, the idea of encroachment is that a few tasks are taken by the software or by robots or whatever, and gradually more and more of those tasks are going to be taken over. And and then what could happen is you could have more of the empty work, right? So that's the concept by Ronald Paulson, a Swedish sociologist,
Mhm.
who talks about the time that you spend at work not doing work.
Mm.
So you could think of taking a long bathroom break, spending a lot of time on the water cooler with colleagues, chatting about the weather and sports and things like that, or gossiping.
Commuting, I guess, too, huh?
Yeah,
Commuting to something like this.
yeah, I was commuting to work, right? And so that would be empty work. And then a similar concept to that is bullshitization, right?
David
Uh,
Graeber,
David Graeber, that's right. Yeah. So basically, if more and more of the useful activities are going to be taken over by the technology because it is done much more efficiently by these robots, then you're going to have more empty BS work that could potentially be done. Um, and that's kind of the dystopian vision about jobs. But that's kind of where we're at, and it's gonna that phenomenon is gonna you could say get worse and worse over time. Um,
yeah.
and but it does give a better qualification to how automation works in practice
So what's
because
this
in
called again? Empty labor, right? Empty. I want to make sure I understood it. Empty work,
empty labor, yeah, empty
empty
labor.
labor. Okay.
That's the same book title. It's Empty Labor by
Okay.
Ronald Paulson.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's a much more realistic view of like what's going to happen to jobs because the public perception is like it's going to be all or nothing, right? You're gonna the robot comes in and takes over your entire job. I think the encroachment approach conceptually makes more sense empirically.
Mhm.
So basically, you figure out that the robots do particular things better than the humans, and then the organizations gradually adopt it.
Mm.
And I don't know whether you followed that Hollywood strike. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
this is a huge problem.
Screenwriters and every yeah, those are the ones that write the actual script for movies, right? Or
Yeah, so,
artists.
you have two kinds of jobs in Hollywood. So you have the writers, it's the people that you mentioned, so the people who write the scripts for like movies and TV shows and so forth. And then you have the actors, right? So the actors, I think they're still on strike, and then I think the writers they just signed the contract, the settlement contract with the with the employers, with Hollywood. And the main piece of contention was not just wages and benefits. I think there was a piece of that too. I mean, it's a classic, labor dispute. But it was about the usage of what is called CGI, computer generated imagery.
Hmm.
And so the idea is that So far, I mean, the movie directors have been using CGI to do like very difficult stunts, for instance, where you didn't want,
Yeah.
actors to get hurt, so manipulate the, you could say, the image with computer generated imagery. And I would say that this is not significantly controversial. Um, and but you could kind of keep on expanding the usage of it, and you could use generative AI, like ChatGPT, for instance, but just one of them, in order to write whole movie scripts.
Hmm.
So um,
Automatically, I guess,
yeah,
without any compensation, right? For the
yeah, and it scares the shit out of the movie writers, and they should
right.
be,
Yeah.
because I mean, if you think about like the history of Hollywood and the movie industry, I mean, we're talking about 100 years, right?
Yeah.
I think the early silent movies were what, 1920s or something, like Charlie Chaplin, 1930s, right? So we have about 100 years of solid movie history with all of the genres that you could think of, right? Like thrillers and dramas and action movie and so forth. And and there's certain tropes to, like, stories that are being used, right? Like, Superman or Batman movies are always, done kind of the same way.
Hmm.
And yeah, you could take the storylines that already exist as the what's called training data into the machine algorithm. Um, and then you could generate new scripts autonomously based off of that.
So like
The-
recycle them
Well, it's
for.
recycling, but then also like generating new, things.
Uh,
So the training data is merely to give the generative AI uh, certain patterns that they could start to work with, and then they develop it. But I mean, it's in a way, I mean, it's not so different from, like, human movie writers, like when they start the job, right? When they start the trade, they would probably have watched, hundreds of movies, right? And they will have, sort of uh, been mentored by other movie writers about basically like the patterns of like how do you write
mhm.
movie scripts and so forth. And that's what, yeah, the generative AI is kind of doing as well. What the labor contract now stipulates. So before the current labor contract, there was no stipulation at all. So if the movie directors wanted to do, generative AI, if they wanted to do CGI, they could just do it. Now under the new labor contract, the movie writers, they um, they can use generative AI themselves if they wanted to. But the movie directors, the owners of these studios, are not permitted to force
Hmm.
these writers to use generative AI if they didn't want to. And so that is like a piece of regulation that the movie writers believe that it would give them sufficient
Autonomy.
leverage to stay relevant in the field.
Right. See.
Um, but I mean, but that's only for official studios. Like think of, like, Disney or
Yeah.
um whatever, these Pixel or whatever, these big companies, right?
Mhm.
Um, I mean, imagine if I was like an independent filmmaker, right?
Mhm.
And my budget is very small, right? So I cannot afford these expensive Hollywood writers. I cannot afford these fancy actors, like Brad Pitt or something like that.
And
So so
the
what do I
movies
do?
mean that too. I would bet because you could just artificially then construct. Think of Avatar,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Yeah, I mean that's why I mean there's all kinds of copyright issues. I believe it was a couple of weeks ago I saw there was a lawsuit by John Grisham and other novelists against generative AI. I believe I'm not sure whether OpenAI was part of that lawsuit, but definitely against like AI companies that are using the novels that they wrote as the
Mm.
training data, right? Because you could just basically you just have the scanned version, you have the PDF version of those books of all those novels,
Mhm.
use it as a training data, and then thereby allow private individuals to basically publish novels without much thought or effort. And it's really patterning it based on famous pre-existing
Yeah,
novels, like John
parroting or
Grisham.
something. Just parroting the original text and then just reproducing a new kind of alteration of it, I guess.
Yeah, and the weird thing is that like you cannot apply the narrow plagiarism standards, right? So, so the idea behind plagiarism is if I reproduce an idea without attribution,
Hmm.
and also if the language that is being used by that plagiarized text is one to one or very close to one, right? But with the generative AI stuff, what you're saying is that you are being inspired by the original authors and you sound similar, but it's not the same.
Hmm.
Right? So it is not covered under the narrow plagiarism standards that we also employ
Yeah.
in academia, right?
Right, 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 right.
So in a way, so the lawsuit therefore has to be much broader, more broadly conceived,
Yeah.
um, to yeah, basically encompass um, the you could say the new work that is being done by AI, which is really a
Yeah.
ripoff in style of the other authors.
Larry,
And
Larry,
yeah,
go ahead. I don't mean to interrupt you. I was gonna try to maybe ask you about a different question. It's somewhat related. So I was reading from that journal, Triple C, uh, Christian Fuchs, he's Austrian descent. He wrote a couple of years ago on this concept of digital labor, right? From a kind of Marxian perspective. But I think all of us are confronted more and more, especially us in academia, but others in similar professions, of the kind of digital work that we do frequently that's either not regulated or not compensated. And I wonder if we should start to count that as work as well. I mean, the things that are around, like responding to emails at a certain time, or just the digital kind of work that many people do voluntarily sometimes for companies like social media companies, um, but it's not counted as work in the same sense. So I don't know about you, what about you, but for me, like when I think about the kind of amounts of emails that I get outside of my classroom, but outside emails that are stipulated, I mean, you have to respond to them, for instance, but it's not like hourly compensation. So a lot of times people that work in let's say they're working at a company or something, they could hourly pay, and maybe the pay is just designated for a particular kind of work. But on top of that, they have digital work that they have to do at home or respond to emails, things like that, or even be online, social media. And I don't know what your thoughts are about that. You know, digital labor that we do every day in our lives, and we regard it as normal, but it is an extra layer of work, at least mental work. And you know, with all this change, maybe it has to be limited. I don't know if it has to be limited or regulated or compensated, I guess. Uh, well, I don't know what your thoughts are about that. Um,
Yeah. So on this issue, like,
yeah, digital labor.
are
Yeah,
we doing digital labor?
yeah, compensation of it.
Yes, we do it.
Yeah.
Now, but then with respect to compensation, I mean, I have a very hard time with that
Oh,
idea. I
okay.
think that as long as the university, I mean, like pays us a salary that is sufficient to, pay the bills, right, to survive, to basically, put gas in the tank so we can come back the next day, and so on and so forth. Um, if we're getting, compensated in that way, I think that should be sufficient. Now, I mean, but then there's going to be, basically negotiations regarding, what the appropriate salary amount is. I mean, of course, this, adjunctification of academic labor, right? Where
Yeah.
basically, you pay adjuncts less than professors, even though they might be doing very similar kinds of work. So I think that's where probably the struggle should be located in. Now, there could be occupations where, like, there's so little amount of, you know, economic security, and maybe the payment might be extraordinarily low. Like, I don't know, Mechanical Turk or something like that. Like if
Yeah.
you're
Yeah. Yeah.
filling out those surveys or whatever,
Mhm.
then, you know, those people, I think I would be very sympathetic to, find extra ways of compensating them. Though I saw recently there was this article about the usage of large language models, LLMs,
Mhm.
among MTurk users, and the absurdity of it can be described as follows, right? So usually you have an academic who does an academic study. You collect the data by doing a survey among MTurk
Yeah.
users. Now, these MTurk users, well, because they know they get paid very little per survey, per click,
Yeah.
right? Usually a couple cents per click or something like that, right? So what they're saying is, why am I not using LLMs in order to do the survey taking for me,
Mhm.
right? So basically, you're kind of logged in, um, as an MTurk user,
Yeah.
but you're not technically, like, your mind is not on the computer. You
Mm.
just let the LLM
Do it.
basically take the survey for you, and then you basically get the payment for
Like a pod,
knowing.
almost like a self-automated pod
Yeah, it's
that
it's it's like a
does that.
bot. Yeah, you
Oh,
use the
okay.
LLM like a bot.
Okay.
And
Okay.
the idea is that, these LLMs have gotten so good that, I mean, because normally you always have like this checkup, right? So make sure that you're not a robot. You have to do
Yeah,
the
yeah.
capture or something like that, right?
Pictures, you gotta make sure you're not a computer. Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, yeah.
Test.
And the thing is that, I mean, I suppose, I mean, with today's LLMs, you might be able to even circumvent those capture barriers, so that you could have basically, I mean, obviously, like, the researcher is still able to, you know publish their paper, right? I mean, you still get data,
Yeah.
and it's not necessarily research misconduct, because the researcher doesn't know whether a bot was answering or a human, right?
Hmm.
um but but it's still absurd, right? There's the absurdity of like from you could say hermeneutical from a perspective, right? From
Yeah.
like we social scientists, we try to learn about the social world by by doing those surveys, right? But
Mhm.
then the issue is, what if the survey was taken by the bot? So you're not really doing social surveys in the real sense.
Yeah, you're right.
Um,
Which
so yeah,
which raises
so
the
what are we
question:
doing?
is it really social scientific research? Then, you know, what do you
Yeah,
think?
so we're not really doing proper social science.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, and I was kind of like, when I was commenting on it on X, on the social media platform, I was kind of saying, what if we had bots to write us the academic papers, right?
Mhm.
So, and basically just to push that even further back, right? So instead of just the MTurkers taking advantage of the technology and automation,
Mhm.
maybe the researchers should do it as well. So we could have hundreds of research papers getting published
Right.
with almost no effort, right?
Right.
So but then I think, but then it pushes it back. So there's this grander absurdity, right? Which is, what is the point of being alive, right? I mean, it really goes back to
Yeah.
this larger question, right? So if the robot does everything for you,
What's the purpose? The sin, right?
what's the purpose of getting up in the morning? And I think that um but that's why I think that the social institutional configuration must be questioned, right?
Yeah, that's good.
So that is to say, what's wrong with universal basic income? What's wrong with giving economic security to everybody, and then
Yeah.
and then you figure it out together. You figure out what you're going to be doing. Finding social
Voluntarily, right?
purpose. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I mean, ultimately, it's about like you have to be able to spend your time in what you consider to be a useful activity.
Mhm.
So I'm not convinced that we're subsidizing universal laziness, but we are subsidizing the freedom to explore the things that you really want to do. And then that's kind of the society that we should be figuring out pretty
Which
soon.
which is interesting. I mean, if you think about sports and recreation, how popular it is in the United States, and the Taylor Swift phenomenon, and sports celebrities, and um, there are things that we enjoy, at least I guess in the United States, but even Europe, soccer is big. But I always raise the question: is that really work, or is it just fun, leisure, but it's kind of given legitimacy, I think, in the public sphere. It's kind of given this view, well, it's functionally important, people go to the games, they watch the games, they become fans, they're consuming, they're consumers. So the salaries and wages that people are paid for to engage in sports are justified. People think that it's justified. It's the old Davis and Moore kind of thesis, like, well, it's functionally important to our culture that we have sporting events and people are amused, and that's why we pay them a lots of money. But the actual functional, I mean, contribution it makes to our economy, I've always raised the question, even in my classes. I was like, besides consumption, and watching, what else does it really contribute? Like, uh, for instance, baseball or something. Because right now the Rangers are in the World Series, or even sports. But they have, I think, a social function. I think they have a cultural function. But the question is always raised: what real economic function do they have besides leisure and recreation? You know, I mean, there are things that are sold. like merchandise, branding, but there's a lot of product placement. But the reason why I raised this, Taylor Swift and that whole phenomenon, uh, she's now a billionaire, and I was fascinated how then yeah it creates new value, economic value. But I think we never question the value of it. I mean, the value of sports celebrities or uh, people that get paid lots and lots of money for a particular kind of function that they play in society. You know, sports particularly, and all the way down to college too. I mean, college sports often are very big. Even in my region of where I live here in Texas, it's enormously big, but definitely also professional sports. So that's just something I'm throwing in there. Think about sports and the value of it, cultural value or real economic value it brings, right?
Yeah, so on this question of like, should we have more of the leisure culture?
Mm,
I'd say, yeah. I mean, in a way, I mean, there's no other option, right? At this point, if of course we fix the distributional issue, which we clearly have not. I think that this is the main thing that we have to figure out. Let's just say, basically making the basic necessities, like housing, food, and so forth, cheaper, or making it subsidized through UBI or something similar to that. But let's assume, I mean, if we fix that particular issue of distribution, I think then, yeah, then the next issue is going to be, the optimal use of leisure time,
mhm,
which, some people might say, well, okay, if you listen to Taylor Swift, you buy her records, you go to her concerts, and you make her a billionaire. That this is not the best usage of our time and money. But I'm not going to be that
mhm.
judgmental,
Right, right.
in a way, because to some extent, I mean, so there's this idea of like superstar economics, right? So, Shervin Rosen, economist, 1980s. Um, and so the main idea is that, with modern technologies, you can basically concentrate more and more income in the hands of fewer people, right? So if you take the music industry, for instance, in the old days, um, I would, have to listen to live music. So I would have to go to the local bar, and like the local jazz musicians from the local scene are going to be playing, and I can be entertained in this way. But nowadays, it's like I can live any place on the planet as long as I'm hooked up to the internet.
Yeah.
I can always watch a Taylor Swift music video on YouTube,
Mhm,
and then based off of watching a video about her. Let's say I live in, I don't know, Australia or something like that, and then I say, but I like Taylor Swift so much that I'm gonna spend whatever, $2,000 on a plane ticket to you know New York or something, right, where she's performing live. And yeah, and I take all of that burden upon me to make that trip, uh,
mhm.
because uh, because I love Taylor Swift music so much, so and that's how you can see that that there's a concentration effect that's happening, right? So I'm no longer reliant on having you know good local jazz musicians, right? I mean, now I can consume the global pop culture.
Yeah.
um
Global culture industries. Yeah.
the global culture industry, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not, I mean, from a
Yeah.
distribution and income inequality perspective, I think it's not so problematic as long as I can be made sure that Taylor Swift is going to pay her taxes,
Yeah.
and I would say quite substantial amounts of taxes. Um, you know, like before she collects it, right? There should be a tax on that. And then I think on the inheritance tax side of things, there would have to be significant inheritance taxes. I was just reading the summary of like the Alexis de
Mhm.
Tocqueville argument about democracy in America,
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
and because I was
Honestly, that's a classic one.
because I guess I was teaching that for a class, and
Yeah.
so I just had to just get the summary together again, and then he was making the argument that that the Americans are more equal in a way than even in the legal arrangement than the Europeans. So in his case, of course, the French because he's from France,
Yeah.
and because so in the European inheritance law, you have what's called primogeniture, right? Which I guess so. This is really a historical argument, really. I mean, because he was living in the early 19th century, right? But the argument is that in primogeniture, male primogeniture, so you give, let's say if you're a big landowner, you would take the property and you would give it to the eldest son, usually. Um, and in America, they were, I don't know whether they were pioneering it, but they were certainly promoting
Mhm.
this idea of equal inheritance. So let's say if you have a rich guy, he has like five children, right? So what you would do is you would split the property in
In
five
five.
equal pieces. Yeah.
Hmm.
And in that way, so over many generations, if you have the idea is like if you have a fracturing of the property, I mean at that time, I mean land property was the most valuable, but you can imagine that similar applies to like money value properties like stocks
Mhm.
and foundations. That in that way, you can sort of prevent the uh, concentration of estates. Um, and that's how um, Tocqueville came to the conclusion that America was a more equal society,
Mhm. More
um,
egalitarian. Yeah.
more egalitarian society.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, this is he can only make that conclusion from a comparative approach.
Mhm.
I mean, of course, if you look um, nowadays, I mean, if you do like comparative social mobility studies and you find that you know like a Danish low income child has a higher likelihood of climbing the ladder, the socioeconomic ladder to become middle class than an equivalent, American poor person, right?
Mhm.
Um, I mean, which is then not surprising because the tax and transfer system, right? It already inscribes how much inequality there's going to be between the high earners and the lower earners, right?
Yeah.
So if through the tax and transfer system you basically, I mean, if you had to graph it, right? So let's say on the on the right side of the scale, or I don't know, let's say on the left side of the scale, you have the poorest, the right side, the richest. I mean, basically, the slope is flatter, right? You can make it flat, relatively flat through the tax system, right?
Yeah.
And
More
then
progressive taxation,
that's
especially
right, yeah,
Denmark.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So if you flatten it out, the income, the total incomes, then of the different parts of the population, then I mean, then it's not so difficult to jump over the hump, basically, to improve your status. Um,
Hmm.
but so and then the other thing is like, okay, let's take it the multi-generational like wealth acquisition example. The Walton family, right?
Yeah. Sam Walton.
Sam Walton, right? So he's the founder. I think he has four children. One of his children I think passed away already, and then it's I think it's like the daughter-in-law or something. But anyway, but there's like four in that current generation. Um, I assume that each of these four children has like their own
Mhm.
children.
Mhm.
Um, but I mean, you can still see. I mean, the logic of like flattening out the wealth, does not work,
Mhm.
right? Because there are, um,
Transfer of
uh,
it, yeah, to
yeah,
the
because the wealth multiplies so fast, right? So you have basically like multiple billions of dollars, right? Yeah. So let's say Sam Walton has, let's say, 200 billion, and then you split it up in the four pieces, right? So you have 50 billion, right, each.
mm, still an enormous amount of money.
Yeah, it's still an enormous amount of money, even though you subdivide it, right? You don't give it just to the oldest child,
Well,
right?
well, maybe there's another example I just thought about because I sometimes use this in one of my classes. In the world of work, the discrepancy between CEO pay and the medium average worker pay of a company. Those if those are really wide in some companies, as much as 1,000 times more that a CEO makes. But other companies are more moderate. Some companies that maybe the ratio is 150 to 1 or something, or 250 to 1. But there's this calculation, the last, let's say, 60 years, the CEO compensation has relatively risen from, like, 1960s, from a CEO making in the US, I think 25 to 1, 65 to 1, it keeps going up. So that illustrates, even within organizations or corporations, there's this problem of CEO pay, accelerating, and not keeping pace or with the average medium pay of workers. So, and how to resolve that issue, the massive amount of polarization of the pay. I mean, think of like Tesla, Elon Musk, and you could calculate, I guess, the average Tesla medium income pay of a worker in a factory, in a gigafactory that they produce the Tesla cars. And if that expands, or if or the wages keep up. I mean, the wages for the workers, compensation, things like that, if they rise over time too. But there's usually like a gap. I think there's a gap, and either the gap shrinks or the gap widens, and that might be reflective also of inequality. Whether it's the pay differences are just extreme, and housing. In the world of housing, I mean, if housing costs keep up with income earned by a lot of workers, if those also kind of widen, right?
Yeah, for Tesla, I don't have the numbers in my head,
Yeah.
because
I don't either.
it's not.
AFL-CIO actually has like a tool. They have like there's some union websites. They have these tools on available data where you can kind of, get an estimate. It's just basic math. But again,
Yeah,
you always have to know if that's a public record. Sometimes, that isn't public record, so you don't have information, maybe tax records or something.
yeah, I
That's
bet the numbers for Tesla are going to be like
yeah,
atrocious, because
yeah,
non-union workplace,
yeah.
you have the richest man in the world, right? So I mean, it just like computing these two facts in your head. I mean, probably going to produce a wide discrepancy between the boss and the workers.
Yeah,
But I know that there were active discussions within the big three. So in Detroit,
right.
car makers. So we're talking Ford, Stellantis, and GM.
Yeah, yeah,
And I think they recently signed the contract where they were giving the workers 25% wage rise, and then only 3 years in order to get to the maximum wage. So let's say if you were get hired as a plant worker in Ford, and then after 3 years, of working there, you get to the maximum wage.
Hmm.
which is pretty good. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's, it doesn't take that much time. Anyway,
Hmm.
um, 25% increase was the stipulation in the contract. The union demand originally was 40%, and they came up with 40% with that number because that is how much the CEO was getting.
Oh.
So the CEO is getting 40% plus,
Uh-huh.
and the union turned around and said, "You're going
Oh,
to
we
give
want
us
the same.
40%.
Oh, that's interesting.
You're going to
Yeah.
give us 40% plus too."
Uh-huh.
And then they got it, and then the management got it down to 25. But but this is kind of where this point of like justice, equality, and all these things are kind of
Yeah.
important, right?
Distributive justice. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
that's right.
Mm.
I think it was this book by um Jake Rosenfeld. He's a labor scholar. He talked about four different mechanisms by which pay is being anchored, or pay is being decided. And oftentimes, yeah, I mean, so I don't have the whole list in my head, but
Yeah,
sure, the listeners can Google it.
yeah,
But
yeah,
but like this idea of like fairness and equity is important, right? That that you anchor it based on you know what workers would perceive to be fair. So in this case, I mean, obviously, I mean, it's a publicly traded company, so you cannot keep the CEO compensation secret, right? Because
Mhm.
you have like SEC filings, right? So everybody saw, okay, she was getting 40%, the boss, right? So why are the workers not able to get it?
Yeah,
And so I mean, if you're like a responsible CEO, I mean, what you could say is, okay, I'm only going to take an extra, 10%. And then the workers would then be fine to say, okay, I'm going to take 10%. Now, but then if you have to consider that, you know, the CEO already makes more money, right? So if you add let's say 10% on 10 million, I mean that puts you to 11 million. That's a lot of money, right?
yeah, enormous.
It's like a million extra versus if I put 10% on, I don't know, 50,000, that's only 55,000.
Hmm.
So it's in a way, I mean, even if you do like the same percentage increases, which means you keep the gap between the relative gap between the CEO and the workers the same, you're still gonna have massive divergence, right? Um, but yeah, I mean, but I don't know, the bosses were just, I mean, it's
Greed.
right. They just,
Greed.
yeah, they can
Yeah,
get away with it, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I used to have like this economics instructor
Yeah.
in community college, and his principle was always like, if a company can get away with overcharging, then
They
they do
do
it,
it.
right? They do it. Yeah.
Yeah. What's really fascinating is that this contradicts sometimes the whole notion of supply demand. I mean, um, which is a major classical economic thought. Everything, the economy is dictated by supply demand, and then people also think that, well, that reflects certain professions are in higher demand, and so the payment wages are going to be higher, and it's all market forces based. But then again, if you think of something like sports or is an exception to the rule. I never could figure out, and I had this discussion with my students sometimes, sports performances, like athletic performances, if you can link them to merit, for instance, like sometimes you have NFL teams or NBA teams where the compensation for some of the players is ridiculous, but the actual team performances are not good. And so it's something related to certain professions. There's an exception. There's a double standard, I think. And that's looked over. It's not based on really merit or supply demand. It's just something peculiar about that institution. People like to watch baseball, they like to watch football, and so they think the quarterback should, definitely get paid a lot of money, even if that quarterback gets injured, in the first game of the season and has to sit out. That person still will make what his contract dictates. Uh, what's interesting with a worker, if he gets injured, at a plant or something, you get workman's compensation, but usually a reduction of income over the year. So I don't know. I always thought that was a double standard. Some of my students agreed, some of them disagreed, but I don't know. You know what I mean? If you think about professional sports,
Yeah,
um,
I mean, so
yeah,
the way how the
yeah,
economists explain
yeah,
it is
yeah,
by simply saying, what is the demand for the product, right? And also what's the supply of that product. So in a way, I mean, the demand for a quarterback at the NFL, I mean, it's huge because you
of
have
course.
many millions of people who are like watching on TV every season, right?
Central figure, yeah,
Yeah, so the
for sure.
demand is huge, and then the supply is very constricted because you're only gonna have, what's a Tom Brady, right? He's kind of
Yeah,
the guy who refuses to retire, right? An old player, but he's been there for many, many years. And so yeah, there's only one Tom Brady, right? And a few of those. So in a real demand supply model, I mean,
hmm. Think it
it's
works.
yeah, yeah, you can explain why these people would be getting paid so much money, right? Um, and in other professions, it's not exactly like that. I mean, yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, if you're like a bus driver, if you're like a factory worker, sure. I mean, there's people who ask for your product, but it's not going to be like millions of people. And so you
Mhm.
have like whatever the 100 people that you pick up every day on your bus route, right? So those are the people
Yeah,
that kind of pay your salary more or less. Um,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah, and then if you get sick, well, I mean, on the supply side on the labor supply side, you could be replaced, right? I mean, like a bus
Mhm.
company would probably have like hundreds of drivers, and then they probably keep a bunch of drivers, let's say a dozen drivers in reserve.
Yeah, Reserve Army of Labor, right?
Yeah, I mean, just in case because you're gonna have drivers call out because they get the flu, they get injured somehow, or something like that. So if they call out, then you can call in the
Mhm.
workers. And then if there's absolutely you know no one available, I mean, well, I mean, well, you could cancel that specific route,
Yeah,
for that particular shift. Then the bus would just be sitting in the garage, I guess.
yeah, I used.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean, so but the main idea is that I mean, if you do like like a common man job, yeah, the market principle is going to be less favorable to that person.
Yeah,
But ultimately, it's like, well, that's why I mean, a social democratic arrangement would probably be the best, right? I mean, in a
yeah.
social democratic setting, I mean, you're probably also not going to have somebody like a Tom Brady as much. Um, though it depends on the sport because I know in the European countries, I mean,
Soccer's big.
yeah, right, soccer. I mean, I was gonna say like if you're like a FC Bayern Munich, right,
Yeah.
or Borussia Dortmund, or if you're like Real Madrid or Barcelona, any of these big teams, right? Uh,
Surprisingly, they even have American basketball now. I've noticed there's a lot of professional American basketball. Of course, at the fraction of the income of what NBA players make, which is interesting because you have professional teams in Europe and they make far, far less than what American professional athletes would make. And they accept the difference. I mean, it's an opportunity. There's a lot of American athletes that will go to Spain or Germany to play. Former students of mine in the past have found success in those leagues, but they pay far less, and it's just kind of professional leagues that operate just to play a game of basketball. I always thought that was interesting. Uh, And so, yeah, it opens up opportunities for athletes who, at that moment don't have the potential, or maybe they athletically they're not as good as they thought, and to go directly into pros in the United States. So then they'll go to Europe or Canada, try to play there. Uh, I was surprised, that there's so many European countries that have these leagues. Um,
Yeah, the thing that upsets me about the American sports
yeah,
was that that the college athletes would not be compensated,
yeah,
right? Which is a real irony because I mean, like if you compare like the college sports, like college basketball, let's say, with let's say NBA basketball, um, yeah, I mean, sure, I mean the college basketball players are like a little bit younger than
mm,
the NBA players, and the main idea is that the incentive for the college basketball players is, so first of all, I mean, they probably attend the college tuition free, so they get a degree
scholarship. Yeah,
without yeah paying for it, so the scholarship, and then at the same time they have a shot at getting qualified for the NBA because the NBA uses the college basketball as a
yeah.
recruitment opportunity. Now, the but then the problem is, I mean, if you look at, let's say, the highest paid college employees, right, especially in public colleges, universities, where you have to publish the salaries, right? Um, you always find it's not the university president, right? It's usually the coach,
Mm,
the coach of the biggest sports, right? That would be the highest paid employee of the university. Um,
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
there's something
Division One, I think is Division One league is usually the highest coaches' salaries. Yeah, definitely.
which
Uh,
sounds totally crazy to me, man. It's
yeah.
like, so you have enormous amounts of revenues that being generated because I mean, so I
Mm,
so I'm not like basketball fan in any way, so I don't know how much you pay for an NBA ticket versus for a college basketball ticket. But for both of them you would charge, right?
mm.
There's definitely money that's
Oh,
coming in. Also, you have advertisement, right?
yeah.
Uh,
There's a quick analysis for this. I mean, the phrase sports industrial complex comes to mind. I mean, sports, in the US is big business, and college sports is very closely aligned with professional sports. And so there's a lot of industries, that even college university kind of benefits from sports, the athletes, the attendants, the donors, all businesses that put their advertisements, on the stadiums, things like that. It's a big industry. So I would call that the sports industrial complex. It's probably a common phrase. Um, you know, but it's a big, yeah, it's very huge. It's very big, especially here in the South. Where I live in Texas, there's huge sports programs, not just UT Austin, but Texas A&M University and other universities, even private universities like SMU, Rice. Enormous is the athletic programs are very, very huge. So they have enormous amount of influence, Um, so yeah, I found that interesting, very interesting.
yeah, but it is ironic because
Yeah,
you have the college athletes. I mean, without them, you don't have anything, right? So you definitely need them. But the college athletes, I mean, like they usually put their heads down because they're kind of saying, well, I don't want them, to cancel my sports scholarship, right? If I criticize the system too much, right? And I do not want to lose my shot of making it into the pro league, right?
yeah.
Um, and
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I think I was listening to this podcast by a sociologist. She wrote a book called Coerced Labor, and
was it
she's
Erin
talked.
Hatton?
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember, but I remember listening to this podcast, and it was based off this idea that there's a lot of kind of coercion and uh, to do things that are that you have to perform at a high level in sports, and you voluntarily, are pushed to the limit. And athletes are under a lot of stress sometimes. They have to balance academics with athletics, and that's a very difficult thing to balance. And the enormous amount of time that they have to train and commute to different locations, and they often maybe miss a lot of class time. It's difficulty to balance this athletics with academics, and especially if it's professionalization of college sports. I mean, because then you're talking about a high level output, requirement. They have to train enormously. So I don't know. I always found that interesting. But the idea of coerced labor is kind of, I'm going to encourage our listeners to look up that book. It kind of goes at the heart of lots of hard work that goes into athletic kind of activities. A lot of people don't realize, especially for athletes. By the way, I should say I was a former student athlete way back in the day, so have some experience with this, just a little bit.
What was your sports?
Football.
Football.
Yeah. So
Definitely
good.
large built.
In
So
the world of sociology, Herbert Bloomer was also surprisingly a football player. I didn't know that. So, um, but
that's quite impressive.
yeah, yeah, Herbert Bloomer, look him up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, where else we want to go with this discussion? What do you
Um.
think?
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways that we could go. I mean, so
Yeah,
the thing that well, there's two things that continuously worry me. I mean, the first is like the climate, right? Where
yeah.
basically like why is it still warm? I sit with a t-shirt on October the 28th. Um, it should have cooled down by now. I think it's gonna get very cold next week, but
Mhm.
especially in the evenings. But yeah, I mean heat waves everywhere. Then you
Yeah.
had down in Mexico, I think in Acapulco,
Oh, yeah, I heard about that.
on the coastline of the Pacific. There was this giant, I think level 5 hurricane that basically wiped out the entire city. Definitely all of the phone lines and electric lines and so forth. Um, yeah, absolute chaos. Where I mean, my understanding is like if you have so much heat that's trapped in the atmosphere, so much solar radiation that you have up in the atmosphere, um, you have a decline in aerosols. Aerosols are usually those are the gaseous molecules that would uh, you know, try to keep out the heat from the sunlight.
Mm.
Um, so you have basically more um yeah, more sun radiation, basically more solar radiation.
And
That's
skin cancer it goes up too. Thinking skin cancer rates are going up.
did you have the numbers for that? I mean, you see it somewhere?
This is going up statistically. Even in your places like Europe, surprisingly. But they're using more and more AI detection for skin cancer. So now they can detect it a lot earlier, but still, yeah, skin cancer has been an issue. So I have to check some of the data, but it's uh, we have enormous amount of sun, especially here in Texas. So I would assume that that makes some correlation, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, so Texas, I mean, well,
Mm,
obviously, I mean, if it's settled by Europeans, I mean,
mm,
who basically they came from a continent that was kind of the least sunny of all of the continents on the
mm,
planet. So if you go, outside of Europe, into regions that have more sun, you're gonna probably have more skin cancer happening.
mm.
I know that like Australia and New Zealand are probably
Yeah,
uh the, the
high high
yeah
high risk.
the highest rates.
Oh, wow.
And it's clearly not because of the indigenous, right, the Aborigines, because the Aborigines, I mean, they're very dark skinned and they're
Yeah.
like them, skin is kind of adjusted to that environment. But definitely a lot of the European settlers that came, over the last 150 years or so, um, uh, there's a significant amount of skin cancer.
Mm.
Um, yeah, because the sun is intense down there. Um, but yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, if you have, let's say, more extreme dry sunshine periods, um, and I know that also the last couple of weeks, I mean, even in European countries, you had uh, heat.
Yeah.
Basically, you have a summer weather in the middle of
Oh,
October.
oh, wow. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's uh, and the thing is, I mean, so people were saying, well, okay, we have El Nino, right? So the idea was that this particular, you could say, wind pattern within the Pacific is causing more heat in the northern hemisphere, which it has done historically too, but never to the extremes of the heat that we're experiencing today, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, if you look at the average increases of the temperature, I think it was like zero point 0.5 degrees Celsius above what we would normally expect to be. And then if you calculate the average from the pre-industrial era, if this year is over, 2023, we have basically crossed the 1.5 Celsius threshold of
Right.
increase.
Which
Uh,
is dangerous. Yeah. Very dangerous. Or,
yeah, and because we were being told under the Paris Climate Accord 2015 that we would do everything we could in order to stay below that 1.5 Celsius increase. Now, but even at that point, I think, they were still predicting that we wouldn't have to worry about 1.5 C until, let's say the middle of the century.
yeah.
Now we've barely made it through, a quarter of the century, right? And and we have crossed that threshold basically.
Yeah.
Um,
Slowed it down. Yeah. Uh, on a side note, uh, I wanted to mention something. Uh, they had actually a very, very old tree here in local area where I live, an oak tree, estimated to be 400 years old, uh, broke down. And this 400-year-old oak tree in Plano, Texas, finally, broke and, lasted 400 years, but now is, demised. It is broken in half. And I think it's interesting that the lifespan of some trees, if that's correlated too, we see older trees that can last as much as 1,000 years sometimes, but with these changes in our environment and the stress put on trees, for instance, the lifespan of trees is shrinking, apparently. Now we don't know. I mean, I'm not like a tree expert, by any means, but I found it interesting that they had this oak tree 400 years, um, and with environmental problems that we have in the state. I mean, it now has died finally. But I don't know how much longer it would have lived. I don't know. I'm not a tree expert, but I wonder with trees and more of them, vulnerable with heat and flooding, that has consequences for our ecosystems too. We know what deforestation does. Sorry, I didn't pronounce it right. but trees dying, for instance, enormously. I know in South America and Brazil and the Amazons, this was always a big topic. You know, the well-being of trees, and elsewhere, right? So I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Is that just the trees? Ever looked at it from that perspective, or
And so the
the
idea
health
is
of trees?
so that the tree does not uh get enough water.
Mhm.
Is that the idea? So you don't have enough rainfall, and then the tree just dries out
Dies.
and
It didn't fall. Yeah, it dies. There's some problem
dies.
with the um, enormous amount of there's an imbalance of the ecosystem, and people are building houses, and the irrigation is starting to change. So a lot of these old trees are dying, uh, and it's devastating because you think about, these are really old trees. They go back 300, 400 years in the original kind of ecosystem of Texas. But you have a lot of this suburbanization and impacting the ecosystems, particularly in areas where they had these trees, historical trees, are very old.
Yeah, so
But it's
I know
not just
for
something in Texas. I mean, I've seen it also in Germany. They have problems with the very old trees that are very vulnerable, and they often have to protect them, not just because of people doing, crazy things to the trees, but ecologically they have to be taken care of, because they want to keep them in memory. Or there's some environmentalists, I think they have a value to keep these old trees safe. But it's difficult with the era of climate change and environmental patterns, that are more radical.
yeah, so
Also,
when you mention like the building up
yeah,
of like properties by people,
yeah,
I for coastal erosion, this is a
yeah,
huge problem because I mean basically humans like to live on the beach. They like to live along the coastline. So what you do is you build up the coastline. So you have houses that are right on the beach. And now, if the sea level is constant, this is not an issue, right? You can keep
mhm,
your house there. But the problem is, of course, the sea level is rising. Um, if you had, let's say, an untouched beach, like untouched meaning untouched by humans, like let's say there's no housing,
yeah,
no
yeah, yeah,
settlements, then the rising sea level is not a big problem because because you have basically think of like sand, and the water just creeps up and then just gradually claims more and more of that of the beach. So you kind of have like natural erosion. That's kind of probably the way to put it.
yeah,
But the problem is if you have human built up settlements, so you have these houses to the right on the edge of the beach. Now what people have to do is they have to put in a lot of effort to, well, it's either keeping the water out, which it's a losing battle, you can forget about that,
mhm,
or it's about increasing the barriers, the protections. So you would basically, kind of like in front of the property, in front of the houses, you would have to build, um it's kind of like a water fence, basically.
yeah.
That
A barrier.
yeah, a barrier, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
a water barrier that you would have to build up higher and higher, effectively.
yeah,
Um, and I know, so I once did a for the research study, I also did a case study of New Orleans,
uh,
which is I mean the geography of that city is totally wild because you have um you have a town that is basically on the water.
yeah,
It's basically a bowl, right? So and the city, the city proper, right? Downtown area is really at the bottom of that bowl.
right.
And that bowl, of course, is surrounded by the water, right? So you have I guess the Gulf of Mexico, right? And then you have the interior lake. I think it's in north of New Orleans. Um, Lake Pontchartrain, I think. And now the physics of like basically being in a bowl is that the water that is at the higher location than the city itself wants to enter that bowl, right?
Hmm.
So basically wants to enter that city.
Yeah.
And so then, okay, what does the city government and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are doing is they are basically creating these pump stations.
Pump out
So
of water.
yeah, so well, I mean, so first of all, you create the barrier, you create the levees that go up higher and higher to basically resist the increase in the water pressure that comes from the increase in the sea level.
All right.
And then, but then you still have like water flooding events. And the more water flooding you have, so then basically you have to build more and more pumps in order to pump out the water. Now, but then so then the higher the sea level, then the higher the water pressure. And then the other thing is that if you're pumping out the water, you then the bowl also becomes deeper and deeper.
Hmm. So it has
So
ecological consequences, right? Or self-destructive kind of.
yeah, it's sort of
You're
like a vicious
damaging
cycle in a way, basically. I mean,
or
you have a rising
eventually
sea level.
it will cause even more ecological problems. No? Did I read you right?
Yeah, yeah, so you have a rising sea level, so then you have to build more pumps in order to pump out the water. But then um, it's kind of like the ground that's underneath that bowl in the middle of the city. Uh, it kind of is. It's not solid ground really. I mean, like it kind of also weakens and
Yeah.
erodes. And the physical effect of it is that the bowl basically gets deeper. And but then the deeper the bowl gets, I mean, of course, the higher the water pressure, right? So in a way, it's a constant catch up effort where you're kind of building new infrastructure in order to, you know, keep the city safe from the water, right?
That's crazy. Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and there's huge, multi-billion-dollar project by, Army Corps of Engineers, right, to basically,
Keep it balanced or keep it.
yeah, I mean, to basically build more levees, build more dams, and of course, we had the catastrophe in Katrina, Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
Uh, but the possibility of another flooding is really just a matter of time.
Yeah.
So it's really a question. It's like,
Well,
well, do you want to live there, right? So,
it's a high
uh,
risk. Yeah. Well, during Hurricane Katrina, there were many evacuees that, at least temporarily, stayed in Texas. Particularly Houston was a destination. So, yeah. So when this happens in Louisiana, this also impacts Texas, especially Texas. Also, coastal areas of Texas are also a high risk. Whenever there's a hurricane that goes towards Louisiana. Um, so yeah, it's a big topic. Definitely, it has great significant impact. And don't forget the oil and gas industry and the coastal areas there, the environmental, damage and pollution. What was that leak that happened? I can't remember.
Deepwater Horizon.
Yeah, there was also this natural disaster, oil disaster, which had significant impact on the ecosystem. So ecological devastation too, lots of ecological devastation. Yeah, that also goes together, I think, with this flooding issue, constant flooding. Uh, it's no
Yeah, I mean
different topic.
it's our addiction
Well,
to fossil fuel, right?
yeah, 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 big
Uh,
topic.
and yeah, so there's I mean, I remember there was this one interview with President Biden, where he was asked, like, can you keep to the Paris Climate Accord, uh, and whatever environmental targets, if you are permitting oil drilling on the federal land, which I think they mean Alaska, mainly. I mean, there might be other areas in the country too.
Yeah.
And then he was saying, well, yeah, I mean, you're gonna have to fix the climate long term by weaning off the fossil fuel, but over the short term, I mean, our civilization is built on oil.
Mm,
I know this myself because I'm still driving, like a regular
mm,
combustion engine vehicle. I mean, many people still do.
yeah.
With a hybrid car, it's a little bit better, but you still need gas. Um,
And it's probably more expensive where you're at, right? The price per gallon. Let me guess, three something.
yeah, I think 325, 330, something like that.
It's about 290,
290.
280. You get a special Sam's Club or Costco, you might get 20 cents cheaper here. But
Yeah, I mean it's very
it's
weird.
still,
I
yeah,
got
it's
this
still,
one station here. It's like 385, I think.
wow, they're really sticking it to you. Wow.
It's like the highest in the area. But I mean, whenever I walk by or I go jogging past there, I mean, it's like I do see people filling
Yeah.
up there. So
Well, this is another question, right? I don't want to go off topic here, but whole supply demand argument, that people use to say, well, gas prices are a result of a low supply, and so there's higher demand, and that's why. But when I look at sometimes in my own neighborhood, it depends on the location of a gas station, and it one gas station is 40 cents higher than another gas station. It's like, how can this be, right? So it makes you really think. People sometimes profit off of, um, just because they can raise prices and they don't really have to really care about supply demand. They just have 50 cents higher, or 60 cents. I don't know if that is where you live. I don't know if that's the same thing. Do you have sometimes some gas stations that will just have $1 more that they charge?
that's right. Yeah, yeah. This
Yeah.
guy here charges at least 50 cents more.
Wow.
But
Well,
luckily, I mean, like so
yeah.
because on my
Uh,
to work, I mean, I always drive by the one gas station, like the Exxon station that is cheaper, that is on the lower side.
yeah.
And it got also a lot of positive reviews.
Yeah.
So I don't have to use the one that I'm right next to. But anyway, it's strange with the gas prices. But in any case, I mean,
Yeah.
there is this civilizational dilemma, right? Where because I mean because it's not just like the car that you're driving and the heating oil that you're using or the heating gas and stuff. It's also like almost everything that we're using within industrial civilization. So, like anything that has plastic, right? I mean, even the microphone is like plastic parts on it, right?
Yeah.
And anything that is containing plastic is a product of oil, basically, right? I mean, that's one of the main inputs. I mean, as soon as we figured out how to do industrial plastic, um, that's when, you know, that's when modern civilization really became possible. I mean, think of all of the, food packaging that we have in order to keep, food fresh, more or
Yeah.
less.
Perishable. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I mean, and as long as we don't go away from these conveniences, I mean, but the only way how you would have to go way how you could do it is if we lived a more primitive lifestyle,
Yeah.
right? So
Or
think
ban
of
it. like Ulrike Herrmann, just ban it.
Yeah, so imagine like if we were living in a farm, right?
Yeah,
Um, where let's say hypothetically we grew our own cattle, our own vegetables, our own fruits and stuff. That would massively cut down on plastic consumption, right?
yeah,
Because we're not going to be using the food packaging. We're basically, plucking the fruit out and then wash it and eat it, basically, right? Um,
yeah.
but I mean, but you can already see like how impracticable that is, right?
Well, you heard of the kibbutz in Israel, right? The kibbutz, they have these like farms that are self-sustaining and they're kind of ecological, I guess. They're small scale. I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of kibbutz are. Uh, but even in, think of Austria, you have, or even Bavaria, you have these family farms, and I don't know how sustaining they are. Maybe it's just for the family and their own consumption of the eggs and the milk. But it might be a small model, an alternative living model. I'm not saying everybody has to go back to agricultural lifestyle, but a kind of, small self cooperative communities, that have some agriculture. Uh, Surprisingly, there's like youth movements in Germany now that some of them are left wing, but they want to go back to living in rural areas, and they have little agricultural farms, and they have chickens, and then they kind of live off the eggs that they get from the chickens, stuff like this. I was reading this newspaper, left wing newspaper, Taz. I don't know if you heard of Taz, and they had a portrait of these young German like university students that are locating these kind of old farms and going in there and living a lifestyle, alternative lifestyle, and they just have a few chickens. Of course, this won't work on a massive scale, but I like the idea of it. It's a little utopian, but I don't know. What do you think? You think this small scale farming, or they call it urban farming too, right? Some of these movements to encourage urban farming in Detroit and elsewhere
I
could,
think it's more sustainable if the global population was much smaller.
yeah,
So,
agree.
I mean, imagine a hypothetical world. I mean, if we had, let's say, 100 million people on the planet, right? I would say that, we would probably have more than enough land, in order to do small scale organic farming, self-sufficient, and so forth.
Yeah.
Um, you know, um,
So you
but
don't think it's realistic, huh?
yeah, so right now, I mean, so because you have to look at the current situation. The current situation is that we are at a little bit more than 8 billion people, right?
Yeah, enormous population.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically you need to have a food system that ensures consistent, reliable food supply for 8 billion people. And if you want to ensure that outcome, I mean, I saw that there was this Indian scientist who passed away recently. I forgot his name, but there was
Uh-huh.
a special obituary about him. And he was one of the architects of the Indian Green Revolution.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
the Green Revolution was it 1970s, I want to say. So at that time there was substantial amount of food insecurity while the population was growing rapidly. And by introducing this green revolution, basically, like pesticides and also
These.
fertilizers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a
Or, you know,
mixture, I think, of fertilizer and pesticide, right? The Indian farmers massively increased productivity of food production. So like rice and like wheat, grains, and things like that.
yeah.
And as a result of that, India not only was the population continuing to grow, then malnutrition decreased, and the country became a food exporter.
Mhm.
Right. So
Still
you,
is, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So you can buy.
Nice.
like whatever basmati rice from made in India and stuff, right?
Yeah.
Um, so it was a great accomplishment, really,
Oh
um,
yeah.
on the engineering side and the food engineering side. Now, fast forward, so today, so there's going to be this issue of soil erosion, right? So, the more these pesticides, fertilizers you're using, I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, imagine like a like a field of land. It needs nutrient replenishment.
Mm.
So you would have to basically leave the field fallow for a certain period of time. And you would also try to use like multiple crops, right? Instead
Different
of
crop.
like, yeah, instead of monocrop
Yeah.
agriculture. Now monocrop, I mean, it seems to have the advantage that you can grow lots of it within, like a specified field. But you basically suck out the nutrients too quickly from the ground without giving it enough time to replenish.
Mm.
So
Problematic.
yeah, so basically, I mean, what you're doing is you are you're maximizing today's output and sacrificing tomorrow's output.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the first argument of the soil depletion, and then the second argument is about about climate change. So basically, I mean, so the more weather extremities you're experiencing, right? So it's either extreme rainfall or it is extreme dryness, right? So either one of those is going to be bad for your crops. And if you have more and more of that, then your crop yield is going to be reduced. Um,
Significantly. Yeah.
yeah. So last year, I think was the first year when the Indian government decided to ban food export or like specific crops. I don't think all foods, but
Rice. There's some rice restrictions. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So like the main crops, they restricted the export
Yeah.
of that.
Follow-up question. I remember doing research. This is like during my dissertation process, but like land grabbing and purchasing of land by global South countries in other countries that's also sometimes seen as a solution to like look for land in another country, purchase it, kind of do farming on it, or just use it as an extension of land that's not available in the home country, and to just engage in land grab and engage in land purchasing. So even a country like India could technically purchase land in Africa or purchase land, in Bangladesh next door. And if that's sometimes counterproductive or ecologically, uh, well, problematic, because then you're just kind of going wherever there's land and you use it, and then, you know, uh, you may produce a lot of food out of it. You could probably produce surplus, but the consequences of engaging in that practice, land grabbing and land purchasing, as a commodity in this new age we're in. I was surprised. I mean, even like Brazil, I mean, there's sometimes foreign countries who are interested in land there, right? But land is a speculative thing. So I don't know if you ever did any kind of research on that. Have you ever looked into it, or especially India? I know India, because of this land issue, the scarcity of land, like there's an interest in trying to look for other parts of the world where one can purchase land, and then you could have an Indian company, that kind of runs it, does something with it,
Yeah, I
or
didn't do too much research in that field, but
uh,
it appears to me that
uh,
you are basically buying time, right?
yeah,
Uh, so
you're trying to buy
with
time.
that, you're
Yeah,
buying time. I mean, so going back to this Wolfgang Streeck argument about
yeah,
the time limits to capitalism.
Wolfgang Streeck. Okay,
Wolfgang
you're talking
Streeck,
about him now.
there's time limitations to capitalism.
Capitalism, right?
Yeah. So I mean, so Streeck's argument was about like the cycle
Uh,
of financial capitalism and the ability to basically borrow your way out of a financial crisis. And he
yeah,
thinks that this kind of method has limitations.
yeah.
And I would say you could use that same logic regarding the
Right.
ecological crisis, right? Where
Yeah.
basically, I mean, okay, we buy ourselves extra time by basically exploiting the land that is not yet impacted by climate change or that
Mhm.
is not yet impacted by soil erosion, right? Um, but but over time, I mean, you're going to be facing exactly the same problems, right?
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I mean, so I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing it, because we get to a point where it's like, again, so for me, is if you're like
Yeah.
the world planner, so to speak, I mean, your main question is how can I keep 8 billion people fed continuously,
Mhm.
right?
What?
Uh, uh,
Yeah. 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 Which, this is what I find interesting. If you think about Immanuel Wallerstein's original kind of theory of world system, you had the core, the semi-periphery, the periphery. And the theme was often the global north core is exploiting the global south, this dependency problem. But I wonder sometimes, even within the global south, there's exploitation of other global south countries too. There's a hierarchy, don't get me wrong. There is this core, multinational corporations, and they have a desire for profits, and so they're going to use countries in the global south to export labor or to do production there because it's cheaper. uh, but think about like a country like India, which some people they say, oh, it's a global south country, but also they also kind of export production, and they also uh, have problems with ecological problems there, not just because of multinational corporations or foreign direct investment, things like that, but even within the own country, there's uh, issues. So I don't know. I'm just trying to challenge this Wallerstein's approach of problems in the world system.
well, so
Yeah.
you're basically saying that
Yeah.
the colonized become the
Yeah.
colonizers, right? So
Yeah.
that's sort of idea, right?
Don't get me wrong, I still agree with a lot of that. Uh, but I wonder if the global system is so complex now, that within the global south, there's like I would call it internal exploitation, or like you can sell off your land, and sometimes there's people that are in power in those societies that may not have the interests of the vast population. And for example, I'm gonna give you an example. Maybe Nigeria. Okay, like there's an enormous oil reserve. There are multinational corporations there, oil companies, but there's also sometimes exploitation of within the society. Like corruption is a very problematic. Environmental pollution is a problem in Nigeria. It's very corrupt, and so I don't know. It
Well, we,
does.
we we know within Nigeria, I mean, that's the
Yeah,
oil companies themselves, are the major cases of corruption.
yeah,
Because basically what happens is that the it's the governments and the oil companies, of course, work together. So
yeah, yeah. Hand in glove. Yeah,
and they basically give these you could say concessions or contracts
yeah.
to these like Western oil companies and like whatever Shell and so forth
Is it
and,
British
and
Petroleum too? Yeah, Shell and British
yeah,
Petroleum.
British Petrol and
Yeah.
Exxon Mobil and so forth, and so they all come in and then they extract like these oil minerals, right? And then sell it back to, you could say, the home market, like the Western countries. Um, and um, and then so the government officials in Nigeria, they get paid off, right? The oil officials
Paid off.
at the top, they also get paid off, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then you also have like siphoning. So basically, you have you could say thieves that are kind of siphoning the oil and they're selling it in the black market.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
And the
that's
country is still very poor. That's what's even though it's oil rich, very
and
for
that's right.
our
Yeah,
population.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
So
Because you don't have the institutions in place. So
yeah. Yeah.
institutions meaning rule of law, effectively. Because I
Right.
mean, you could take a country like Norway,
Yeah.
which similarly has like a
Oil.
massive oil exploration. But they discovered the oil in Norway, I would not say in the last 30, 40 years or so. So it's not a very long history. It used to be that Norway was a very poor country, with the main export being, I think, wood,
And
uh,
fish.
yeah, like wood and fish and things like that.
Yeah.
And then it became rich because it discovered all the resources. What's important to say is that they developed high accountability, rule of law institutions, um, before they discovered the oil resources.
Hmm.
So by the time they discovered the oil resources, when the government of Norway created what is called the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is basically the government's it's like the government's endowment, you could say, right? Like the
I like the Alaska Permanent Fund, right? Almost like it. Yeah,
um
like a mutual fund that could benefit Norway and it could be
that's
used,
right, that's right. Yeah,
tapped
yeah. I mean,
into.
the
Yeah.
main thing is like so some of it is used for the current government budget, which funds like civil servant salaries and stuff like that, schools. But I would say a big chunk of it is for the pension fund. So like the national pension fund. So they try to be very responsible with the sovereign wealth fund. But you could run it responsibly because they have the rule of law institutions in place. To like while they're extracting those natural resources. In the case of Nigeria, they don't have that. So they
Yeah.
start off with basically, clientelistic, corrupt regime, who then discover these oil resources, who are then, extracting it for their own profit. And then you have you could say, the pirates that are extracting it for their own profit and selling in the black market.
Or nepotism, stuff like that, like clientelism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
clientelism, right? Where basically, like, if you're connected with the leadership of the country, then yeah, I mean, you're gonna live very well because you're gonna
Get a cut.
take a
Yeah.
cut from these oil revenues.
Yeah.
But the average population, well, so the average population is interesting. I mean, they kept quiet because of these oil subsidies. Because basically the government is subsidizing the oil for the masses.
Mm.
Um, so that's why I mean you would also sell, like, if you have like a gasoline car. I mean, it would be much cheaper to buy gas
Yeah.
than it is in like a Western country or something, right?
Wow.
Um, but then the controversy comes by cutting the fuel subsidies, because basically, I mean, because like the government takes out a lot of loans, right? And and then the creditors want the money back, and then they can't pay or whatever, or they have to pay, and then the repayment term is then to cut the fuel subsidies, right? To basically extract more revenues for the government, but they're taxing the population effectively.
Yeah.
So
Makes it worse.
yeah,
Yeah.
so then you're gonna have anti-government protests, basically, right? So you have low legitimacy of these governments.
Yeah.
Um,
Levels of trust are really problematic, I think, in Nigeria. Trust is very, yeah, high corruption, low trust.
yeah, right. So I mean, like, if you're like, let's say, a private person, you're like, of course you're not going to trust the government.
Yeah.
with the money. So you're like, well, okay, then give it back to me in the form of these fuel subsidies, right?
Right.
Um,
Mm.
uh, but yeah, so there's a lot of discontent in a place like that. I mean, you'd have to really clean up the corruption, and then
Yeah.
and then the other things then will also become better, right? Because the less corruption you have, I mean, the more of the nation's resources will go to the places that would benefit the society the most, like hospitals and schools and infrastructure and things like that.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's
Copy.
something that would have to be fixed. So on this like global south versus the north, I would
Oh.
say that so the biggest dividing line is basically US versus China. I mean, it really goes down to this observation about the Cold War, um, because so what the United States has been doing over the last 3 years, I would say, the pandemic, um, was to do quantitative easing and do it, very excessively, right? So basically printing dollars in order to, calm the financial markets, right? To solve liquidity problems in financial institutions that are short on cash.
Mhm.
Um, and then now because we were in an inflationary period, so then the Fed starts to
Raise interest
increase
rate, right? Yeah.
the interest rates. And now you have the capital that's from the other countries and flowing back into the US. The US dollar is now stronger than the other currencies, which sort of reflects the high interest rate policy. And um, and the other countries, I mean, they're not particularly happy that basically the Fed does monetary policy, that there's a monetary policy for the world, but really kind of doing it for self-interested purposes.
Hmm.
And so there's this idea now. I mean, in countries like China or Russia, Iran, perhaps India, Brazil, and South Africa. Um, could we do an alternative currency regime that does not rely on the US dollar, that does not make us vulnerable to United States monetary policy? And also, I mean, it has to be considered in the context of the global wars that we are fighting too, right?
Right, 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 right.
I mean, basically, I mean, we're kind of fighting the proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. We are fighting a proxy war which is close to a hot war
Hmm.
with Iran,
Right.
because I think there was like some military installations, U.S. military installations that were attacked in Iraq and Syria, right? And the
Yeah, I
Americans,
follow that. I follow that. Yeah.
right? And the Americans retaliate, so the Americans then send their own air force to destroy targets there that is backed by Iran. So then there was like a speech that Biden gave about warning China not to attack the Philippines recently, because there were disputes between Filipino vessels going in the South China Sea, where the Chinese already had a lot of boats, had a lot of their military installations.
I didn't know about that one. Hmm.
Yeah, so all of these things are happening right around the same time, and so and then the U.S. Is basically trying to expand the sanctions regimes against what it perceives to be the enemies. So, so if you remember when Trump tore up the Iran nuclear agreement, right, then started applying the sanctions. The
Yeah.
sanctions were not really removed even under Biden, so that kept going. The new Russia sanctions that were imposed on top of the original ones in 2014, um, after the Ukraine invasion. um, massive sanctions put in place. Then you have the sanctions against China for like semiconductor trade. So, so the U.S. is playing a game of full-on confrontation, and then,
Hmm.
and the thing is, so if you were any of these, like, you could say, adversary of the U.S. camp, you then say
Yeah.
to yourself, well, okay, if if I want to do international trade and I'm subservient to the dollar regime because I'm having to use the dollar, I'm exchanging my currency for the US dollar in order to purchase the things from the other countries. The other countries receive the US dollar and then they would then exchange it for their own currency and things like that. You know, there's an incredible amount of vulnerability that if, the US, in terms of politics and military is ratcheting up the pressure against them to then use, the economic tool of US dollar sanctions to basically um, shut down the trade for that country or to reduce the amount of it.
Like economic warfare, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's economic warfare. So
Yeah.
um, I saw a graph recently that said that 86% of international trade is done by US dollar, 6% is their renminbi, 4% for the euro, and then 1% for yen, and then all the other countries' currencies is much smaller. So
Hmm.
it is a nightmare scenario, therefore, for countries like China or Russia, Iran, right? So those are the adversaries of the US. And they want to create this alternative currency, like BRICS based
Will it be
currency.
kind of like a national currency, or you think it will be like an actual new currency that they may actually create, like a new kind of currency to counter this dollar dominance? You think it'd be actual like a new currency or of some sort that is,
There's a good
uh,
question. So I think they're
yeah,
still discussing it.
okay.
They could be using the RMB, so the Chinese currency,
Mhm.
which is already the second largest in the global usage.
Wow.
Um, but but so currently I'm still skeptical. The main
Mhm.
reason is that that China, for self-interested reasons, does not want the full convertibility of its currency.
Hmm.
Because right now what they're afraid of is fully convertible currency, that is to say, full tradability of the RMB. They fear that they're going to have capital flight overnight.
Oh, wow.
You have a lot of rich people that are, let's say, they're holding significant amount of capital assets. They could transfer their assets out of the country. It's difficult though, right? Right now with substantial capital controls in place, where basically the Chinese government controls the currency flows from inside China going out and from outside China coming back in, right?
Wow.
And they do that through Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is basically the kind of the connector to the global financial system. And yeah, so China does not want to give up the control over its currency
Hmm.
and thereby does not allow the full convertibility of the currency. So then you're going to have an issue. So let's say the Russians, let's say they wanted to escape the US dollar sanctions.
Mhm.
So they're not using the USD to buy stuff from China that they need for their economy to run the warm economy. So let's say they sell, let's say, wheat and oil to China. China pays them with the RMB, so they're holding the RMB as asset.
Uh-huh.
But then the question is, okay, well, can you do something with the RMB? So you're definitely not able to buy anything from the Western countries because they're not taking
Uh, you can only
RMB.
buy it from China then, right? I guess buy it back. Is that how that works?
Yeah, so you
Buy
would have
products
to,
back from China.
yeah, so you'd have to buy things
Mhm.
directly from China.
Yeah.
Um, or
Hmm.
you could just decide to hold the assets for now and not do much with it.
Hmm.
You can, maybe, yeah, back up your own currency a little bit. But
The
uh,
ruble, you mean Russian ruble?
the
Yeah.
Russian ruble, yeah, you can back up the
Huh.
ruble. But yeah, but so in international financing, much of it is done also via USD. It's going to be very tough for the Russians in international financing. They haven't had so many bad experiences with China, though again the RMB is not flexible. They can only buy things specifically from China.
Hmm.
But they have had bad experiences with India. So so what happened? So the Russians were selling the oil that they couldn't sell in the West. So they sell it to India. India takes the crude oil and converts it into refined oil, and then they resell the refined oil into Europe, into the Western countries. And so ultimately, I mean, basically, the West was paying a lot more money for oil ultimately, and the Indians were collecting the middleman fees.
Oh wow.
Okay, but now, okay, back to Russia, India. So Russia sells the oil. They receive the rupees because they couldn't get the USD because the USD was prohibited. So they collected the rupees. The Russians then turned around to the Indians and said, can we pull the rupees out of the country, so out of India? And they said no. And then they said, okay, can we use the rupees to buy Indian companies, right? To basically,
Oh,
and in that way, basically generate more income, for Russia. And the Indians said no again. So, because
you buy rice at least, or something.
yeah,
Uh,
so this is a real big question. It's like, okay, well, what are you doing with the rupees? I mean, well, I mean, are you going? Yeah, I mean, are you going to be able to buy things at least from the Indian market?
yeah.
I mean, maybe the Indian market doesn't have perhaps all of the things that they're interested in having, right? I mean, it's like like American semiconductors, German cars. I mean, like there's certain things that, like in the world market, that there's high demand for it. Um, Maybe there's not so much in India that the Russians want. And in any ways, I mean, like basically the Indians stiff the Russians, and the Russians don't have a choice because again the USD sanctions, right? So what am I trying to say? Well, what I'm trying to say is that this alternative system that the global South, which we can call BRICS are the main representative.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah, yeah. Didn't they
Um,
meet together or something? They had a meeting.
yeah, they do. They have regular meetings, like at least
Yeah, yeah,
once a
yeah.
year. But I so whatever the aspiration is for this alternative BRICS currency, it is definitely in its infancy stages. It's not a completed project whatsoever. There is
Agree.
just not this consensus that exists among the global South countries to really hang together, and that's really um, within this financial hegemony system. It really plays to the benefit of the U.S., which can basically, I mean, keep the status quo regime going, right?
Yeah.
Printing as much money as they want and having other countries buy that currency. Um, when the U.S. dollar went off the gold standard, 1971, I think Connolly was a Treasury Secretary at that time, and he said to the Europeans, "The dollar is our currency, meaning the U.S. currency, and it's your problem." Right?
Hmm.
Um, because basically, I mean, so at that time, basically, what happens is that the Europeans and the Japanese, they were holding a lot of US dollars because they just kept on printing it to fund the Vietnam War. And the Europeans and the Japanese were saying, okay, just you can't keep doing that. So we want all of the USD that you gave us um, redeemed for the gold because of the dollar gold exchange standard, right? I think it was like $35 for an ounce of gold.
Hmm.
And of course, the Americans, they didn't have enough gold to have all of the dollars, redeemed for it. So is then at that point the U.S. government said, okay, screw it, we're gonna give up the dollar gold exchange standard. Um, and yeah, so basically it's, I mean, like you think about it this way. So the so-called allies of the United States, right? The countries that the U.S. calls allies within the world systems, right? Theory, really. Um, those allied countries are vassal states of the U.S.
Huh.
Right? So there's to say they have to follow whatever the U.S. government says. I mean, regarding financial policy, economic policy, and also military, political affairs. So on all of the important domains, they kind of hang together, and that's why I find it very interesting. Like the two big wars that we're seeing in the world right now, right? So Ukraine and the Middle East, which right now there's uncertainty. I mean, do we have a war in Gaza, right? Specifically where the Israelis are sending the troops in, or do we have really a broader war?
Hmm.
Because the Israelis are hitting positions in Syria and Lebanon, the Americans are hitting positions in Syria and Iraq, right? So then there was like rockets that were fired from Yemen. They were shut down in Saudi Arabia. What's very interesting is that so as soon as you had the terrorist attack against Israel, the Ukrainian government immediately made a statement that was pro-Israeli because what they were saying was that the Russians were supporting Iran and Iran was supporting Hamas.
Hmm.
So really, there is a proximity between Russia, which is a Ukrainian enemy, and Hamas.
Hmm.
So really, I mean, so if you think about it, I mean, it's like so these kinds of conflicts, they are kind of interdependent, and
Interconnected.
then
Yeah.
they're connected, yeah. So and then the U.S. is kind of the outside power that is also backing one side in that conflict. So the U.S. is the main backer of Ukraine and of Israel, and that's, yeah, that's also the reason why then, like, if you have like the European countries that immediately are also taking the Israeli side.
Yeah.
which is, I mean, it is very controversial. I mean, within the Arab world, I mean, for sure,
Yeah.
there's a lot of animosity against Israel for doing the ground invasion in Gaza. Because if you look at the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, I mean, it is atrocious. I mean, you basically so right at the beginning after those terror attacks, they cut off the outside supply, so the electricity, the water, the food, and so forth. Um, Now they say, okay, we're going to allow a few humanitarian aid shipments through the Egyptian border crossing. Um, I don't know how much of that came through there. Um, Yesterday, when they started this ground incursion, they shut off even the internet, so there's no more, communication network from
Yeah.
Gaza to the outside world. Um, I mean, the bombing campaigns are continuing. I mean, you have like 5,000 dead Palestinians at this point. I mean, the numbers will almost certainly multiply further.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, it is a substantial amount of discontent, I would say, about this particular ground invasion. Now, but then it's like, okay, well, if you're the Israeli leadership, I mean, it's like, what's your choice? Because if you're saying, okay, we're not going to do anything, well, then the Hamas would basically, they would
It-
have the launching pad to do it again, right?
yeah. It's one of those difficult conflicts. Yeah. Historical conflicts. Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
and so I mean, within this global conflict, I mean, the U.S. kind of is at the center of it to some extent. Um, because I mean, so the main motivation on the U.S. side is it's basically you want to control the world, and by doing and and in order to do that, you have to have as many allies as possible, right? I mean, what the Americans call allies, but you could also call them vassals, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so it's like those that have to listen to the
Bigger one
U.S.
on the
position.
block. Realpolitik. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a
the
big
real.
topic. Big
Yeah, the
topic.
realpolitik. I was reading the book by Henry Kissinger
Uh,
about called it leadership. So he looked at
oh wow, you read it? Oh good.
yeah 6 of his favorite leaders that he interacted with during his lifetime, which includes Lee Kuan Yew, Anwar Sadat, Margaret Thatcher, Richard Nixon, who was his boss as president,
Yeah.
then Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle, and and all of these examples are really people that swung very pro Western, as say pro American in a way. Um, right? Because I mean, if you think of just Adenauer, the example, right? So uh, at the time, so there were two visions in West Germany, West German politics, right? So you had the guy named Schumacher was
Yeah.
the
SPD.
chairman
Yeah.
of the SPD,
Yeah.
and Schumacher's position was that German unity came first. And so at that point, I mean, the Soviet Union basically said, we're going to allow for unification of Germany if Germany became a neutral country. So it was kind of like the Austrian solution.
Yeah.
The Austrian solution. And Adenauer's position was we accept the division of the country if West Germany could join NATO.
Hmm.
Um, and at that time, I think the U.S. position clearly was um, to integrate West Germany into NATO, so to basically be on Adenauer's side. And Adenauer, he did have the majority. I mean, he had the FDP and the CDU and FDP. So it was Adenauer's vision of the West integration that succeeded. But it did come at the cost of that
Of course, yeah.
vision that was going to last 40 years, right? Um, but and for in Kissinger's eyes, I mean, this was really showing the the leadership capabilities of Adenauer
Mm.
because of this ability to, you could say, defy the sort of the common man sentiment, which is let's just unify the country.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, yeah, but then you could also take the the more cynical take that well that I mean that Kissinger was using the you know only examples that were where the decision was made for the pro-Western outcome, right? If you think of like Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president, who was fighting Israel. I think it was in the '73 war, um, Yom Kippur War. And then when the Egyptians were defeated, then he turned around and it was like, okay, we're going to sign a peace treaty with Israel,
Yeah.
becoming the first Arab country to do so. Um, and it wasn't so much because he was Sadat was pro-Israeli, but rather
Realist. He was a realist. Yeah.
yeah. So at that time, so under Nasser, the previous president, who had this vision of like Arab socialism, right? And Arab socialism would be under the tutelage of the Soviet Union, right? And the Soviet Union provided some financial support and also the military, right? Like, tanks and airplanes and things like that. Now, but I think at some point, I think the Egyptians kind of they realized that kind of Soviet support wasn't really that good. So I mean, if you look at like the 6 Day War, right, in '67, that's when Israel basically won the war. I mean, they took on all of the Arab neighbors. I think at that time it was Jordan, it was Syria, it was Lebanon, and it was Egypt, and they they destroyed, I think, almost the entire air force of Egypt. I think in the first day of the war, right? So so I think at some point I think the Egyptian leadership kind of realized, okay, if we wanted to keep security in the country, we have to swing over to the U.S. side because
Mm.
at that time the Americans were supplying the Israelis, so it was clear that the Israelis were doing well because of the American support.
Yeah.
So
So they altered their tactics. Yeah. Switched sides, huh?
yeah, they switched sides. And now it was interesting. I was listening to this podcast with Jared Kushner. He was the son-in-law of the former president. Um, and I mean, I know within public media, I mean, there's a lot of like negative rumors that are being said about him, blah blah blah. But actually, I mean, if you listen to his interview, I mean, you can see that he's a smart cookie, and he was touting the Middle East initiative that advanced. He and his team advanced, and it produced the Abraham Accords in 2020,
Hmm.
which normalized diplomatic relations between Israel and the Arab countries. So I think UAE was one of those countries, Morocco, um, Sudan. So there were a few, and also it opened the dialogue with Saudi Arabia, where the normalization has not been completed yet. But this was a big diplomatic initiative that ultimately had worked out. Um, yeah, and it improved the diplomatic standing of Israel for sure. Um, no, but they're not out of the woods because obviously there's a direct conflict that Israel has with the Hezbollah, right, in
Lebanon,
Lebanon,
yeah. Yeah.
then the Assad regime in Syria, uh, and then with Iran itself, and then with the Hamas. So it's anyway. I mean, it's a terrible conflict. That's like
Yeah, of
that
course.
that's unloaded,
Just have,
and my concern is that I think the world. I mean, so I still have my default expectations is still that this particular, even this Middle East conflict, and then this like Eastern European conflict, can still be geographically bounded. That is to say, it's like a local conflict that will be basically burning up and flaring up, but it will remain fixated at that location. It's still possible for that to happen. And that, I mean, it's going to sound very cynical, I know, but bear with me on this one. I think
yeah,
um, that having a locally bounded conflict is in the immediate future the best possible outcome, for world peace, right?
because it stays local or that region. Yeah.
Because it stays local to that region.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, there is a small chance
Bill's over.
that it balls over.
Yeah.
I mean, because okay, so you have like the big powers, right? So you got Vladimir Putin, you have the mullahs in Iran, right? Xi Jinping in China, then Biden in the US. And then you have like whatever the smaller groups, right? Like Hezbollah leaders, Hamas leaders, and so forth. And if any of these people deciding to do anything stupid or provocative or, you know, like basically, lighting the Tinder match, um, then we would be in an escalatory spiral,
No.
and we could have a global, we could have a global war. I mean, and I hope that the cool heads will still prevail ultimately.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but there's no guarantee of that outcome either, right? I mean,
Do you think that the conflict may impact elections or in Western countries like maybe um, it being used as a discussion in presidential debates, foreign policy becomes uh, critical again, in the presidential debates. I mean, whatever country it might be, and if it benefits the right wing parties or left wing. Curious to what extent it benefits populist or more than uh, classic liberal democratic. Uh, what I'm saying is, does the conflict actually benefit left wing, right wing parties in Europe or US? Like the Arab Israeli conflict. I mean, does it actually benefit or have any consequences for how even the U.S. Democrats may have to readjust their view of foreign policy, or the vice versa, how Republicans may readjust their foreign policy, how they address the conflict. Curious if it could be exploited by populist, for instance. People, that I don't
Um,
know.
yeah, well, so generally speaking, I mean, the so there used to be this very clear bipartisan consensus
Right.
that the US, would be a multilateral player. Um, or let me put it in a different way. I mean, that the US would do its best to maintain its hegemonic, position within the global order, right?
Mhm.
And that it would have to basically fund and support these big foreign wars, whether it's in Ukraine or in Israel. Um, some people say in Taiwan as well. And I would say that this position is taken by most of the Democratic Party and some of the Republican Party. So, in number terms, it would be enough votes to sustain that consensus.
Mhm.
But also, it appears to me that this consensus can and is being undermined by the MAGA faction inside of the Republican Party, right? So there was this motion to vacate against the speaker, so Kevin McCarthy at that time, because I mean, as a condition for him to become the speaker, he had to agree to allow for the motion to vacate, which basically means you have one person who can call, a vote on the speaker, right?
Hmm.
And so that's how he was removed. He had 8 people voting against him. And while you have the search for the new speaker, the last 2 weeks, there was basically no further passage of the bill of
Yeah.
funding bills for the government
No.
that would include money for these foreign interventions. So it appears to be the case that there is now sand in the wheels of that U.S. system.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so any political topic, I mean, it can be exploited
Yeah.
in ways
For
by
internal domestic, debate or
minority faction. Yes,
uh,
by minority faction. Um,
so I guess we'll see how it plays out in the next elections.
Now, but I did find it interesting though. So the new speaker, Mike Johnson,
From Louisiana.
yeah, so he's one of these like evangelical Christian, like very right wing on like LGBT and like abortion and social issues. And he's pro-Israel, which again is, I mean, it's not uncommon for evangelicals to take that view. But he was very anti-Ukrainian, has been. But it's very interesting. On the first day when he became the speaker, he changed his tune. Now he says, well, yes, we should be funding Ukraine. We should not allow Putin to take more territory, but now we should tie it to certain conditions of, whatever financial congressional oversight, things like that.
Hmm.
Now, what does it tell me? Well, it tells me that there was a lot of pressure from inside of that Republican caucus against a new speaker to make sure that certain foreign policy issues are going to stay within the bounds of what is considered the U.S. Foreign policy interest.
Mhm. Yeah.
And what is considered to be the U.S. foreign policy interest, is coinciding with the interest of the military-industrial complex, um, which basically wants to fund every war. So they want to fund the Ukraine war. They want to fund the Middle East war. Um, and I mean, like, so is it? But in my analysis, is also is not in opposition to funding these wars, because I mean, well, because I mean, the cost of a loss, I mean, it would be catastrophic, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Um, but I mean, but there hasn't been any broader political exploitation. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, like, so the German position, I mean, is I think the German leadership is I mean, they're now fully behind Ukraine for sure.
Yeah.
I think they were kind of hesitant for a long time uh, to go all in. Now there's an indication, I think, that there is a full commitment from Germany to back Ukraine. There's also a commitment to back Israel, but I think that has to do with. I mean, it's not just deference to the U.S. It's really about guilt. That's really it's still everything is about the Holocaust, right? So
Yeah.
for the German government, and therefore they think they cannot take critical position um, in the way that Arab countries would, or for instance Turkey. I mean, even like the Turkish president Erdogan, he's basically said, you know, yes, the Westerners, the Europeans, they owe something to Israel, but not Turkey, right? So uh, and they don't like the attacks on Gaza, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Regional divide. Yep.
Yeah, there's different regional perspectives on this matter. Yeah, but anyway, I mean, but for me, the main takeaway is that, like, yeah, basically, like, how do you prevent a further escalatory spiral? And I think, I mean, a lot of people who are sitting in the capitals, who are sitting in power, I think they are thinking about the same question. Like, how do you stop the escalatory spiral?
Yeah.
And it is by being conscious and careful about it that you know we haven't crossed the threshold to World War III at this point.
Yeah.
But we still could, right? I mean, there's definitely a possibility of that. Um, so I remember there was this Landsprecht podcast, the last one, where they were
Oh
talking
yeah.
about
Yeah.
the Wagenknecht's movement.
Party. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So
She's going
you're probably thinking about her when you were asking the question about the, you could say, political exploitation back home.
yeah.
Um,
She of course is thinking about creating a Danish style left party, social democratic kind of hard on immigration and hard on multiculturalism, but still very much against, or for economic justice. So it's we don't know exactly. I mean, if this party will ever really actually make it to the next stage, but it's in development, and she has like 10 members, current Linke Partei members that are planning on joining her, and they're going to exit the left party and going to create this new party in January. And it may actually have consequences for the Linke. Linke may dissolve as a political party, but they are still then they have members in the German Bundestag, but will lose all sorts of power because they will be below that threshold of 37 members when those 10 people exit. And it may have an effect on the AfD.
Well, it would cut the funding, right? But I don't think it
Yeah,
would remove them
yeah, it would cut the
until the
funding.
end
And
of the parliamentary term, right?
we're worried that it may have a disintegration of the left, the Linke, because they already are often below the 5% threshold, and they don't make it into the Landtag in some of those smaller states. But this new Wagenknecht party, it looks like it may be a populist party that will compete with AfD. It may also, you know, be consequential for social democrats. Some social democrats might also jump over. So it's really uncertain. It's still being developed. If it turns into Wagen, if they will actually call it Wagenknecht Party, I don't know. Or she, has, had controversial positions. She's kind of been pro-Putin, she's kind of, or at least been accused of being pro-Putin. So yeah, it's quite, people are watching, they're thinking what consequences it might have, and who knows what direction this party is going to go. But it's going to model itself off of this Danish, social democratic model, which is a very, anti-immigrant view. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the assumption is that the Danish social democratic model has worked in a way, because
The voters vote for them. The voters,
yeah,
yeah,
so they were reducing the right wing populist support
yeah.
by combining your pro welfare arguments
But
with
with anti-government, or with
immigration,
excuse me, anti-immigrant.
anti-immigration. Yeah, because I
Yeah,
mean, there's this argument of welfare chauvinism, and
yeah.
there's a huge literature in political science, sociology, social policy on this topic, welfare chauvinism. Basically, only using welfare programs to benefit citizens in the country and not foreigners. Um, and it's not so much of an issue in the United States because our welfare system is so crappy anyway, even for citizens, that you don't really have incentive issues for immigrants. In the European countries, it is more of an issue because you also have like less control possibilities um, in basically the highest conflict zones in the world, which is basically Middle East and North Africa. I mean, that region is very much prone to conflict and violence, which then causes migration. So, in a way, if you cannot steer migration, then yeah, there's going to be a massive jump, a massive spike in migration, and there's going to be distributional struggles. There's going to be struggles about the ability to integrate enough people into the local labor markets, into the schools, into hospital resources and all these things. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I know. So in Germany, I mean, like one of the biggest topics, and other countries have that too, is housing, right? The cost of housing, which is
Oh yeah.
increasing. There's clearly a scarcity. There is not enough house building relative to the new population that's entering the cities, right? And it's in that context that that then you have a desire for scapegoating, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, even though I mean,
It's
it's like, I mean,
xenophobia.
yeah, I mean, like a migrant has the same like housing needs as a citizen, right? In the discourse, what you can say is, well, if you have a scarcity of the housing, you always want to give it to the citizen.
Yeah.
But in reality, I mean, it's like it's going to be market demand supply. Basically, I mean, whoever has the money to
Yeah.
to pay the rent, I mean, is going to be able to live in there. Um, and yeah, and kind of like, yeah, the logic of the market and the logic of citizenship is completely contrary, right? Um, yeah, because the logic of the market just says whoever has the money can get housing, right? And then the logic of the citizen is that you want to protect those people first.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, and if you find yourself in that kind of tension, then yes, I think that the Wagenknecht movement is gonna draw a critical number of votes. Um, but my worry is that she has sort of a lot of this like really like short term focus in the same way that the AFD has. So, for instance, okay, you have the inflationary issue, and then you pin the blame on basically the Ukraine war and the German decision to prolong the war through military aid to Ukraine. And I mean, you can see how short term that is, right? Where it's like, okay, I just want the gas. Putin has to sell me the gas cheaply, solve that particular problem for me. And
Yeah.
it's clearly it's so short term because okay, like suppose he solves you that problem, so he turns on the gas again,
What
so
about
you can
next
more
crisis?
cheaply. He has Ukraine under his control. He's going to attack the next country down the line. I mean, there's a lot that it's a very short-sighted analysis, right?
I,
Um,
I think I think the attempt is to try to just put it into a political cycle that fits with the election cycle. Like you said, short term, just to have the most voter impact to get the party uh up propaganda just so that you have people that are voted in. And like you said, there's no real thinking outside of this box. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It's real short-term thinking. It's a very common populist fallacy, It's very simplified talk. It's meant to be very simplified, but it's not really strategic long-term and probably not doable. Uh, for
yeah. So
instance, even the AfD wants to like exit out of the EU. I mean, it's crazy, real but populist discourse electorally is successful. I mean, you hate to say it, but it is successful with a lot of people that vote that certain way. So it simplifies, I guess, the political election process to just create a populist kind of party that's different from the AfD, right? Um,
yeah,
with the
yeah.
FDP, they have this problem. Go ahead, go ahead. I don't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead. Yeah,
No, but I mean, see, I mean, the main issue is that so that the issues we are seeing are multiplying, right? So the Middle East conflict, the Ukraine war, the lack of economic growth, development, the lack of like fertility, right, at home, right, that's gonna have negative impacts on the economy. So much more of a scarcity mindset that's going around. Then the climate change, which definitely is going to worsen the scarcity because if you destroy a lot of like livable area, right? Um, so if the future is so much driven by scarcity and inequality, right? Then it's very surprising that democracies would succeed under those circumstances. Because I think this idea of democracy works in in a setting of abundance, right? Everybody has enough resources. Everybody can, you know, like you can have a big middle class. Everybody can participate in society. All these kinds of things.
Voter turnout.
Yeah, yeah. And the more of a scarcity situation you're creating, I think the less likely you're able to sustain, um, you know, democratic regimes, right? Um, yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, I mean, countries like, Russia, China, Iran, I mean, and then there's some other authoritarian countries in the world. I mean, yeah, I mean, they do have, lower per capita GDP, um, you know, but authoritarianism, I think, is more like the default. You can have like, somewhat richer countries with authoritarian systems. You can have, really poor countries that can also be run by dictatorships. Often that's usually how it works. Um, if you want to have like really functioning democratic systems, I think you really need to have this idea of like shared prosperity in place. I don't think you can get around that. Um, yeah, and we're seeing much less and less of that. So I think, I mean, yeah. So my expectation about you know the trend line of democracies is that is that I expect it kind of to decline, right, in a way. Um,
Hmm. You're a pessimist.
yeah, I mean, it's like, I mean, even in the U.S., right? So I think, I think we were closer to the end of democracy than some people might believe, right? Because
Hmm.
there was this interview with Mark Milley after he stepped down from his chairman of Joint Chief position. Um, and he said, yeah, I mean, that he wanted to make sure that the military does not mess in the election. That was his promise, his commitment. Because he says that he swore loyalty to the Constitution, not to the president. Um, so he was really an important figure to keep to keep the status quo alive, effectively. Because I mean, usually, I mean, we know what happens. I mean, in like strong military states, like Egypt, like Thailand, like Burma, right, Myanmar, where basically, I mean, if the military goes in, right, I mean, or if the military sides with a dictator, right. So in this case, I mean, basically, Trump says that the election was stolen from him and he deserves to be in power, right, regardless of what the actual vote was. Yeah, I mean, if he had convinced enough people with the guns to be on his side, I mean, like, let's say even if let's say all of the judges, the justices that were denying the, request for, canceling the whatever pro-democratic ballots, even if that had, I mean, even if the judges had not done these kinds of things and they didn't do those things, if you have enough people with the guns, enough people from the military to
The mob.
Yeah, I mean, if
Mob
they
is
had
there.
decided to, if they had decided to side with Trump, I mean, that's why it's really exciting. I mean, when I was reading this interview with Larry Hogan, the former governor of Maryland, because he was the one that sent the National Guard to DC during January 6th. And he was, and the guard was basically held up on the border of DC because they were waiting for the Pentagon request to go through. And yeah, but any of these soldiers, right? I mean, if like hypothetically, if they had decided to to swear loyalty to MAGA, I mean, this would be the end of the U.S. democracy, right?
Colin Crouch. What was it? Post Democracy, that book he wrote? Yeah. Post Democracy. I don't know if you heard of Colin Crouch.
Colin Crouch, yeah, he's a British
Post
journalist.
Democracy. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a real worry, concern. Uh,
so
the,
what's Crouch's main argument? Is it about
well, that's a new regime. I mean, post democracy is a kind of, the loss of decline of democratic institutions and uh, authoritarianism creeping in, or he was focusing more, I think, global South examples of authoritarian capitalism or authoritarian regime types. But uh, even the idea of stolen elections is sometimes used as a trigger, to engage in regime change. Thinking of, I think it was Milosevic. Can't remember the guy's name, but
Serbia?
the claim that there's a stolen election, somebody uses that claim, and then there's a kind of military operation or something engaged in, or like you were saying, the usage of the military as a way to start a coup, for instance. But yeah, so we might be in a post-democratic age. That might be uh, definitely a concern in the next few decades, 21st century. Uh,
Right. I mean, because so
uh,
right now, I mean, so it's complicated in the U.S. political system is that so you want to have basically only institutionalist parties, and right. So what I mean by institutionalist means people that believe in the democratic process, right? So basically, okay, I have an election. I put my name on the ballot. If the other guy gets more votes, then I congratulate him on the victory. That sort of thing, right? So that's like an absolute belief in the democratic process, and that's what I mean by institutionalist. So you can really have a functioning democratic system, small d democratic system, if basically in the U.S. case, both of the political parties are have faith in this process, right? Are both institutionalist. Ever since 2020, I would say that we have a one and a half institutionalist party
hmm,
system.
okay.
So basically, you have the Democratic Party, right? And then you have parts of the Republican Party, and then the Republican Party itself. I mean, so it's true that the moderate, like the institutionalist Republicans are the majority within the Senate and the House, but many of them are also like the German word is Mitläufer,
Oh, yeah.
right?
I know that.
So if you have, let's say, the MAGA would take over again. So let's say Trump wins the election in 24. So then even the so-called like institutionalist Republicans, the centrist Republicans, are going to back the leader. So in this case, Trump. In this case, the MAGA. Um, and that's why also like if you look at the debate for like the speakership, right? At the beginning, they said, okay, so Kevin McCarthy was voted out, and then you had the two other guys. The one was Scalise, who was also from Louisiana, just like the current one, Johnson, um, and Jim Jordan, right? And so Scalise is basically he's the institutionalist. So he's like a classic Republican, just like McCarthy, right? So he raised a lot of money for election campaigns for other candidates, right? Which is usually in America that's the main qualification to be the speaker, right? Um, like raising money for other House candidates. But and Scalise had most of the support of the Republican caucus, but not all of it, right? Because MAGA wanted to only vote for Jim Jordan, and so that's why Scalise actually dropped out, and then gave Jordan the vote, and then Jordan, I think he only got to 200, I think, votes. He needed 217. So there were clearly some of the centrists that were anti Jordan. Um, yeah. So then Jordan had to drop out. Um, yeah, and then finally with Johnson, it's like then there was this agreement by both the MAGA faction as well as the centrist faction, right? They were like, okay, we have to find a speaker now, finally. But even Johnson, I mean, I would say he's a little bit more friendly to MAGA, I would say. That's why he was acceptable to MAGA.
Yeah.
But you can already see this midlife logic, right? Where there's sort of like the centrist people, they were like, okay, if you put a gun to my head, I will I will support a MAGA candidate. And the same thing, like,
Well, yeah.
yeah, so if
I've
Trump becomes president again, then the centrists will again they will completely be loyal to Trump, right?
There's this book I once read, Rechts vor die Mitte ist. That was he was a sociologist, rechts vor die Mitte ist. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term. I can't remember the guy's name. I think he died a couple of years ago, but he was arguing about this center being bogus, and actually the center is already to the right nowadays, or increasingly, and that the idea of a center in politics uh, is kind of bogus itself, and that actually the center is owned by the right, and that there's always a constant alignment of the political spectrum that benefits often to the right. And that's what, like, your concept of Mitläufer uh, itself illustrates this, that I mean it shifts to the right, the center shifts to the right. So there's the question of what the center is. The center is basically whatever you want it to be. Uh, and I mean, in different countries, maybe there is such a thing as a center. Maybe even the political system in Germany, it has a little further left, and you have some center moderates, in the CDU, that are not part of the AfD, and then you do have the populist right. But in Austria, I'm curious where the center would be. Is the center the Greens? Is the center the what do they call them, the Neos? I mean, even there, it's always a question. When you say the word center, uh, in what political system are we talking about? They may call them, sometimes there's political parties in Sweden, for instance, they call themselves the center party. Um, but they reflect maybe, far right policies. Or so even if you call yourself a centrist party, you may, actually be more right wing than you thought. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's kind of
So,
like
so the
way,
way how I
yeah,
was using the term
yeah,
centrist
yeah, yeah,
is in the U.S. context was
yeah,
like basically preserving the status quo
Okay,
of the political system, right?
okay,
More or less.
makes sense. By the way, I remembered his name now. His name was Kurt Lenk. Rechts, wo die Mitte ist. Kurt,
But it could very well mean
uh, yeah,
like that the overall consensus is shifting
to the right.
or to the right. Yeah, that could very well be the case.
Yeah,
Um,
because
so
that the reason why I bring this up. I'm sure you read Anthony Giddens, The Third Way.
yeah,
Third Way.
I was going to bring that example up
Go
actually.
ahead. Go
The
ahead. Go ahead. Third
yeah,
Way is a great
the
example of
third
this
way.
illusion of this sort of centrist leftist, but actually it turned out being neoliberal.
Yeah, it
You know?
was neoliberal because basically what
Yeah.
happened
Yeah.
was in the early 1990s, right? So at that point, the Soviet Union just collapsed, right? Francis Fukuyama's liberal democracy thesis was at its height, at its peak. And at that point, you know, so the Democratic Party in the U.S., the Labour Party in the UK, the Socialist Party in France, and the SPD in Germany. All of these parties they had been out of power for so long. Specifically for I guess since the well in the U.S. it was like I guess
Clinton era, right?
Jimmy Carter was the last one, right? So it was like 1980 roughly, right? And so over like about a dozen years they were out of power, and then the Democratic Party they hired these consultants. Like I think Dick Morris was the most famous one of them. He was one of the main political advisors of Bill Clinton, and also managed his campaign, right? With like this the new Democrat, right? That sort of idea. And these consultants, they were basically saying, look, if you want to get the money that the Republicans have to be competitive in those swing states, um, you have to do what they are doing, basically, which is to have a program that benefits two constituencies, basically. So you have the rich, the wealthy corporations, right? Like NAFTA, CAFTA, permanent normal trade relations with China, all of these trade policies, right? That were benefiting wealthier people. And then you appeal to the professional class, right? The people that are paying pretty high marginal income taxes.
Like managerial class, right?
Yeah, the managerial class, right? I mean, the ones that are below the ownership class, but the ones that were definitely above, like like the common man middle class, you could say. And so those were the two classes that the Democrats should appeal to. They were also the most likely to be voting. And then the Democrats would then also become competitive money wise. Because, I mean, in a world where, you know, you allow, so as the rich people, they keep getting richer. So therefore, the influence that they have within the policy making process is increasing, right? So then eventually what you need, I mean, if let's say the Democratic Party sticks to the like Franklin Roosevelt coalition, which means you try to appeal to like lower middle class, like working class, that sort of thing. Uh,
Blue collar.
yeah, blue collar, then you're gonna lose because you're not gonna be competitive for big money, basically the big money donations. So that's why the Democratic Party said, okay,
Third way.
we're gonna go third way, basically, which is we're gonna take the money from rich people and we're gonna make
Uh,
policies for rich people.
but what I found interesting is with Anthony Giddens, he tries to actually like create in the book, at least when I remember reading it, what it sound like theoretically, what the move away from old left to a kind of third way social democratic language, I guess you could say, of altering your language. And you're like, you want to alter the way you describe things, and you're trying to kind of move away from this old left legacy into a kind of, I don't know what you can call it, third way, that kind of is
So
in the
so the big
center.
concept is like
Yeah.
activation, right? Labor
Okay.
market activation.
Yeah.
So
But it,
so 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 in the old days, you would usually say, um, you have losers of globalization, right? The losers of automation, technological change. So we're just gonna, increase welfare spending, right?
mm,
And and then you're gonna use the tax transfer policies to reduce income inequality. That would sort of be
I remember the word
concept.
modernization always was used too. uh, any kind of semantic, use of words that would again remove itself from this old left framework. And that's from the gist of it. I mean, even the way you describe welfare as an institution, you'd be very centered in the center. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
But
So
the
I
German
mean,
Social Democrats
basically,
and go ahead, go ahead.
you were saying
Yeah,
activation. So that was the key word
yeah, yeah, yeah.
within welfare. So we wanted to reduce the unemployment rate. Um, fordern und fördern is kind of the German verbs, right? So you wanted
Uh,
to subsidize lower income people, but then you also wanted to demand of them to look for jobs.
yeah, meritocratic kind of.
Yeah, so it was,
Uh,
and the idea was like you're blending the liberal and the socialist messaging into
yeah,
a coherent whole that takes the best out of both philosophies.
yeah,
And, but I mean, the discourse sounds nice, but it was a thoroughly neoliberal approach
yeah.
because
Reframing it. Yeah.
yeah, it's like in terms of the policy impact. I mean, in terms of discourse, of course, the discourse is beautiful, right? Who doesn't want to blend liberal and socialist elements?
Mhm.
But in the actual policy impact, it was thoroughly neoliberal, right?
Oh yeah.
Basically, what you're saying is you're blaming the victim, right? You're basically saying, you know, well, you haven't gotten a job because you didn't do you didn't follow all of the prescriptions of the labor market agency that wants to um direct you to new jobs, and you were
Yeah.
just too lazy to take it up, basically. um and and so in a way it's like, yeah, in a country like Germany, like you could do like welfare cuts could credibly be done by a social democratic government, right? If you really think about it, right? I mean, like,
Yeah. Using the language of third way.
I mean,
The justification. Yeah. Yeah.
Helmut Kohl was a really conservative guy, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
and by conservative, it's structurally conservative. So at that time, the welfare state was big; it was expanding, right?
Uh,
Um, and also after the reunification with East Germany, the welfare budget increased a lot, right? Because you had all of these, 40, 50 something East Germans who, became unemployed, and you just send them into early retirement, right? Um, so the welfare budget was ballooning, but he didn't, but Kohl didn't do much to change that system at all. Um, and then it was changed under Schroeder, right? So they started cutting that program.
Yeah.
Um,
That's yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Sorry.
and it could only be done by a social democratic government in a certain sense.
Ironically,
Yeah,
the party of workers.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's a strange
Thinking with
part.
Labor and Tony Blair, right? Uh,
Yeah, the biggest changes are done that are anti-left was done by the left. Similarly, like if you remember, like Richard Nixon. I mean, in terms of his foreign policy, right? So in '68, there was a campaign against, I think, George McGovern. Um, or was McGovern in '72? I wasn't sure. I think '68 was Hubert Humphrey,
yeah,
and then
Minnesota.
'72, yeah, George McGovern, right? Um, and right, so there was this argument. Well, the Democrats are going to be soft. They're going to be soft on communism, right? There was always the argument, right? And then when Nixon came in, what did he do? He signed a peace agreement with North Vietnam, which basically pulled out the American troops from Vietnam, from South Vietnam. He established diplomatic relations with China, People's Republic of China, which at that point was
Mao,
politically
right?
isolated
Mao.
with
Still with
Mao.
Mao?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, with Mao. It was really Zhou Enlai's decision. Zhou Enlai was the prime minister at that time. And Mao at that time, I mean, he was kind of elderly, he was kind of sick. And yeah, so basically, it was Nixon who was able to be friendly to these communist countries. Even though, I mean, like the Republicans at that time, they were considered to be like the hardline anti-communists, right?
Yeah.
That was sort of like the self-identification, but it was only Nixon who was able to then turn around and be friendly to these communist governments.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so that's always the irony within the history, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And but anyway, were you asking something about the Austrian system and like
Yeah.
what's the
If
left?
there is a centrist element in any of the parties, I really don't know too much about the alignment. I know the Greens are to the left. I know that ÖFB is to the right. SPÖ is to the left. Then there are the FPÖ, that's far right. But I don't know. I don't know about the neos and the. Uh, I think they're like market liberals, but I could be mistaken if it's similar to
Yeah,
what
that's
the.
right. The FDP, basically,
Yeah.
the market liberals.
So is the SPÖ, Social Democrats in Austria, are they centrist? Are they trying to be centrist? Are they more Labor now with Babler? I think it seems they're more left with Babler. You know
Yeah,
the
Babler is a more left-wing candidate,
yeah,
that's for sure. I
yeah,
mean, his
but
rhetoric definitely
yeah,
is more on the left side.
okay,
So there was this very embarrassing video of the Austrian Chancellor in the Hammer, right, where he was talking to the donors, to the OVP donors, and he basically made fun of poor people. I mean, he said, like,
crazy.
we cannot have poverty in this country because if you wanted to buy a cheap meal, you
McDonald's.
could go to McDonald's, right?
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Yeah,
Uh,
had
and
trouble with that one.
um, and then he was also complaining about, like, why do women not go to work, right? They should be working more and things like that.
Yeah,
Um,
but he's a conservative politician. Yeah,
yeah, he's conservative. So I mean,
uh,
actually, I mean, like, obviously, like, among his donors, I mean, he probably was clapped, right? There was like, they would probably support what he's saying. Um, because his party is basically, I mean, there's like three big factions, right? You have the civil servants who are basically always
Yeah.
they always protected from the market.
Yeah.
Then you have the industrialists, right? Like the
Yeah.
business people. And then you have the the third faction are the agriculture. So but usually like big farmers nowadays, right? So those are those are the main clientele within the Conservative Party. And yeah, so basically this position of like you know like these like these dumb working class people, right? They should be working more. It's gonna get a lot of support within his clientele, right?
Yeah. Right wing populism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And but then for the Social Democratic Party, they're kind of like, okay, where that creates an opening, right? It creates an opening on the left because as soon as you have so the inflation was going up, then you had the Salzburg regional election where the KPO got 11%. Um, and then I think in Salzburg City, I think did the communists gain the mayoralty
Oh wow.
as well? I'm not sure
Hmm.
whether they got, but I think they got a lot of votes there
Hmm.
at that time. So that was before Babla became the party chair. Now I'm not sure whether the communists are able to repeat that election outcome. Because now the SPU is now covering the left flank. Um, Now, but then in terms of the absolute voter support, I mean, FPU has 30%, the SPU is at 25%.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure, I mean, whether you have to wait until like that you get closer to the uh
EU election, right? European elections.
to the national election,
What is that for Austria?
which will probably be next year, like
Okay.
next fall or something. Um, yeah, and then you'll have to wait for that outcome, right? That maybe if it gets closer to it, the SPU might get more votes. Um, but right now, I mean, if they're at 25%, I mean, they're a little bit better off than they were at the start of the parliamentary term. They're at 20%.
Oh wow.
It's historically the worst result. The OVP is at about 20%, so they're kind of screwed because they had this very successful candidate, Sebastian Kurz, this young guy,
Oh yeah, I remember.
and and Kurtz basically what he did was he pulled a lot of the right wing supporters to his side. So he had the core support, the conservative core support, which was 25% of the electorate, and I think he got 36% or 37%. So basically, one third of the voters were basically the swing voters. Some of them were non-voters, but then a lot of them came from the FPO, right?
Hmm.
And that was the magic wand that he was waving. Um, yeah, and then when he came down with the corruption scandal, I mean, the problem is that the guy who's in charge now, Nehammer, I mean, he was the general secretary of the OVP, and he kind of talks more like a party manager, you know, rather than a leader.
Hmm.
And if you're a manager, I mean, it's okay, but but in a democratic country, you're not going to win any elections, right?
Yeah, that's
Right?
true.
You have to be charismatic speaker, and you have to be a great organizer. Um, you have
Hard
to
to win. Yeah.
be able to formulate your visions, right? Which he doesn't have. So
Right.
yeah, it's an exciting time in the politics there.
Hmm.
Um,
See what happens next year. But next door, Switzerland, a worrisome trend with the Swiss party. I think they got significant.
The
There's
the
some,
Swiss People's Party, the
yeah,
SVP.
the
Yeah.
anti-immigrant party.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
and then so the vote share for SVP increased, and then the vote share for the Green Party decreased.
oh,
So they were the big losers of that election.
yeah,
And yeah, I mean, the Swiss are they're already very provincial in their outlook.
yeah,
They're very usually unwelcoming to outsiders,
very nativist. Yeah,
very nativist. But uh, but yeah, I mean, whenever you have any kind of international turmoil that's happening, if you have a new wave of refugees, then they're very, very sensitive to that, right? And they would, ideally they want to put up the drawbridge, right? They don't want to let any outsiders come in. Um, but it's a question, like, I mean, how much can you ward off the foreign influence? Um, because you're gonna have people like, let's say, if they land on the shores in Italy, which a lot of people are doing nowadays, like from
Lamdusa.
Lampedusa, like from sub-Saharan Africa. And these kinds of migrants, I mean, they are in a way different than, let's say, I mean, in the 1990s, if you remember, the Balkan Wars. That's what I mean. I went to school in Vienna. I mean, we had a lot of Balkan descent people that uh, you know that came to Vienna and Austria, uh and yeah, there's a cultural difference between the Slavic and the Germanic, but then it's like they're still white people, right? Now, I mean, yeah, there's much more of this, racial ethnic diversity, right? That's brought into Europe, and um, yeah, and the nativist reaction is going to be significantly stronger, right? I mean, you could say it's outright racism. Maybe that's certainly a piece of that too. I mean, uh,
Switzerland.
yeah, the fact that, I mean, if there's like a
Didn't they use racist posters? I think for the Swiss party, they used the racist posters as campaign. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's about keeping out people
yeah,
that have foreign backgrounds,
yeah.
especially those that are, yeah, visibly different. I mean, you could say, Italians, Germans, Austrians, right, French. Yeah, they probably don't have an issue with those people, but yeah, they would have an issue certainly with people from Middle East countries or from Africa. But yeah, I don't know, if you just look at the pure numbers, the demographic developments in the world, it is going to be those regions, so Middle East, Africa. Um, that's where the fertility rate is relatively the highest. So, I mean, of course, if you project out, like, let's say 50 years, 100 years, yes, I mean, the world is going to, it is going to look less white. I mean, this is just, I mean, if you extrapolate those trends into the future, I mean, that's what you're going to be observing, right?
Yeah.
And uh, and now, but then what the Europeans are saying is, well, then it's even more important for us to put up the drawbridges and to keep this place clean, I guess, really, in a sense, keeping out the migrants. Um, my expectation is that those barriers cannot keep out people over the long term.
Yep. Push and pull factors. Yeah.
Yeah, again, it's like migration, it's going to be there. The cost of travel is decreasing, right? So like, airplanes or boats or, like overland transportation, cars and things like that. So there's ways to move people around. Um, I believe that there are certain human rights standards that many European countries do not want to go below. That's why, I mean, even in Lampedusa, I mean, you still see like, like boat rescue actions, right, undertaken by the authorities. And right now, I mean, you have like a right wing government in Italy, right?
Yeah.
Meloni.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like like basically right now it's like you have the most right wing combination of governments that Italy has ever had, right? Because it's a coalition of the Conservative Party, which is Berlusconi, the Berlusconi successor party, and then you have like the two far right parties, which is Meloni and then the Northern League and the Salvini, right? So you have like
Wasn't it
two.
Berlusconi's party at one point? I know he's dead now, but wasn't he the leader of the North
Well,
League?
he's the leader of Forza Italia. So Forza
Okay.
is a conservative party, so that's the center right officially. And then you have two of the right wing parties, which is the Northern League and the Brotherhood Party, which is Meloni's party.
Uh,
Um, and then the Brotherhood Party was the largest in that coalition. That's why Meloni became the prime minister. So you have one of the most right wing governments in Italian history, and yet, I mean, and yet they're facing more of a migrant crisis than before. Right? I mean, it's not their fault. I mean, it's kind of
yeah.
it's really the exigencies of the moment, right?
Well, it proves also that migration exists outside of nation state politics. I mean, what you might do as a nation state might be reflective of national politics, but migration itself is an international phenomenon that nation states themselves think they can solve it, but actually it's like a regional. Uh, you see the big maps, the migration patterns are all over the world. But that's what's fascinating. I think a lot of times there's political parties that like you said, get elected with a very anti-immigrant, discourse of politics. But nevertheless, I mean, you're going to still have migration, which is interesting, So,
Uh, yeah,
especially if there's turmoil in the hot spots, or if, like in North Africa, there's a lot of people that move. They are seeking to go to Europe, and there's a crisis, or humanitarian crisis. Yeah, so that's interesting for me.
yeah. I guess the main thing is like you need to you need to reduce the gap between the global south and the global north, right?
Yeah, that's a good argument.
That's ultimately like if you wanted to reduce migration, that's basically the way to go. Um, and yeah, and in the global north countries, I mean, it's clear from a lot of the practices regarding, you know, like international policies, like trade policies, like stipulations about like free trade, about debt repayment, right? Like high interest rate policies against like poor debtor countries, right? Um, and then also like protectionism, right? Keeping agricultural goods out of the markets of rich countries, like poor countries' agricultural products from the rich countries. Yeah, all of these policies, I mean, they kind of ensure that there is vast differences between the global north and the global south countries.
Yeah.
and then it becomes then migration is just going to be out on the table, right? You're going to have people that are enterprising and they want to escape the poor conditions that they have back home. And yeah, I mean, I cannot look
So like
down in that direction.
asymmetry between the global north and global south is the cause for massive migration. That's how I understand your analysis. Yeah. If there
Yeah,
was
yeah, it's a
less,
bit.
if there was more, a little bit of easing of those asymmetric relations and reduction of global inequalities, maybe it would have an effect on reducing global migration. You know?
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I
That's
mean,
how I understand it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, Now, but then it's like you could still have like a lot of migration, even if the world was relatively equal. I mean, think of like
Yeah.
Canadians who are coming down to America to work here,
Yeah.
or vice versa, right? Because these are both countries that are like part of the global north. They're both very wealthy, right? And yet
Yeah.
you still have movements, across the border to do jobs. But it's not controversial, right? I mean, I don't think anybody in America cares if you have a bunch of Canadians working here, right?
Right.
Usually, usually within global North, movements are not very controversial, right? Um,
Mhm.
yeah, it's usually like from the global South because it's about the magnitude of the movement, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because the assumption is like if you live in the global North, it's going to be comfortable enough where you most people don't have to move out of the country. And then the few that are coming in, it's like you might be welcoming to them, right? They increase the diversity in the country and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, usually from the global south to the global north, um, it's just in the magnitude, right? It's the numbers are going to be just going to be much larger. Um, and in some cases, the movement of those people is going to be less controllable, right? I mean, if you remember um, when Vice President Harris, she flew down to Guatemala, I think it was last year, right? She gave a big speech, right? I mean, of course, she brought in like the coffers, right? She brought in money, basically bribes to the Central Americans governments to basically make sure that they are supposed to improve the economic conditions back home so that there's less incentive to migrate to America, to the US. Um, and it's clearly not working, right? So, um,
Yeah.
I mean, the movement is large. I mean, I think over the last 10, 15 years, it was the Triangle countries in Central America. But those are relatively smaller countries.
Hmm.
Now you see like Cubans and uh, Venezuelans and Colombians that are coming in bigger numbers. Um, Interestingly, also Chinese nationals are coming in as well.
Hmm.
So there's kind of like a desire to escape the situation in China as well now. So yeah, there's significant pressure, I believe, uh, to 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 go into the global north. Um, and
Definitely. Yeah.
and then within the country, I mean, there's like a shift in consensus. You remember when Trump was in power, right? There was a discourse around sanctuary cities, like New York City, Chicago, right? The big cities in the north. Um, And in New York, I mean, the presumption behind the sanctuary city was that any migrant that was requesting housing assistance from the city government would receive it. And now this policy is biting in their ass because basically what the border states, like Texas is the main one, but probably like Florida does that too, where they're funding one-way bus tickets to New York City, right,
Yeah.
for these migrants. And the migrants, they were also being told that, hey, by the way, if you apply for asylum in New York, the city is going to give you housing. Which in most cases, I mean, what it means is like they take hotel rooms and then they convert them into, like asylum seeker facilities. And now, of course, you have like rents in those neighborhoods that are skyrocketing, right? You have significant amount of housing, shortage pressures, and yeah, now there's nobody who talks about sanctuary cities, right?
Yeah.
Now I think the sentiment is more like, okay, can we reduce the flows, right? Um, but I mean, you see, also like those liberal cities, I mean, they have a very hard time like reframing the discourse, right? Because they started with a narrative of the sanctuary cities, as a way to, um, to oppose Trump, basically, right? Calling him like a xenophobe, which he was as well. But then now the shoe is on the other foot because the southern states are shipping the migrants up north, so now the cities in the north are like, well, okay, maybe maybe we have to shut down the border, right?
Hmm.
But because these are still liberal cities, right?
Well,
So then what do you do? I mean, well, you what you would probably do is you would do more conservative policies on migration, but you don't focus your discourse on it, right?
mhm.
It just becomes an uncomfortable topic, basically, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Um, because I mean, because and that's the thing. I mean, so I don't. That's why I mean I don't look down on like the New York City mayor, right? Eric Adams. Like if he says, okay, we're overwhelmed, we have to, you know, help, like the city out. We need more federal funds, we need more state funds, and things like that. Um, really kind of passively managing the crisis, hoping that it will go away.
Well,
And then he's been criticized when he says, well, we have to stop the sanctuary city stuff, right?
yeah. Yeah, he's in a difficult situation because he's a mayor of a major city with so many people, so many services, so many yeah, things to manage. It's a huge city, right? New York. Yeah, massive, yeah.
Yeah, so you have to make difficult choices. I mean, where
Yeah.
it's like, okay, you will accommodate as many migrants as you can. Um, I mean, as a city government, I mean, there's not really much you can do about the border in a real sense. I mean, it's kind of federal policy, really. Um, you could allocate more funding on the border security, the border fence. But I mean but the higher of the fence you build, I mean, it just means that people will just climb higher, or they will look for another loophole,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, it really goes again. It goes back to this Wolfgang Strick concept of like buying time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you put more impediments to border crossings, you're buying time, right? You're not solving the problem, right? Um, so
Yeah, that's interesting though, because Wolfgang Streeck, focuses on what will be the end of capitalism, right? But I don't know how that relates to immigration. I'm not sure how that. Um, Maybe globalization will, become so overwhelming that it threatens the idea of nation states is being able to control such chaos. Let's use the word chaos in the global system, but ultimately, I mean, yeah, it's out of the control of people. Maybe that's the bizarre things that politics used to be seen as the way to solve chaos or control. But now politics and the institutional framework in which we conduct politics is very limited, to what it can do. I mean, like you said, migration, people are just going to climb higher if the fence is built higher. So a lot of things are out of control of nation state politics. What I mean is, does that make sense? I mean, they can do things at a local level, but ultimately these are external, outside of what nation states like do often.
yeah, and
Maybe,
also,
maybe, yeah, go ahead. Does that make
well, so
sense?
yeah, my migration and capitalism are also closely related to each other, right?
Okay, okay.
So because you have,
With nationalism, is that how we put it together? Like with nationalism, they're
well,
closely,
so it's
yeah,
it's about capitalism. It's about the world market. So there
okay,
was an essay by Doug Massey, Patricia Fernandez Kelly. These are both my professors
okay,
in Princeton.
okay.
It was about the after effects of NAFTA, the free trade
Oh, okay.
agreement, where basically, I mean, the main idea was basically the agricultural lobbies in America said we want to enter the Mexican, agricultural market.
Okay.
And so, because the American farmers, they got subsidies from the federal government, right? So they would always be able to sell their goods cheaper than the Mexican farmers could. So the Mexican farmers became unemployed, and and then that was a big push factor,
Okay.
migration. So you're pushed out of their own country, then migrate to the U.S. So in a way, I mean, it was basically increasing globalization, market integration that created the pressures to migrate
Mhm.
into the US. Um, yeah, and you could also say like mismanaging the decolonization, right, in a lot of developing countries, right? Um, which then where you then have like warfare, you have conflicts and things like that. Um, yeah, and then as soon as you have conflicts, then you're going to have a lot of pressure to migrate.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I mean, so capitalism, the way how you integrate countries into the global market economy, and you keep them in the peripheral state, you keep them at the bottom of the sort of global value chain, and yeah, and then there will be a need for earning more income. And oftentimes it's like if you have like, let's say, very small economies,
Mm.
poor economies, remittances are oftentimes one of the biggest economic contributors in that country. So so in order for those economies to even subsist, you have to have people that are migrating to other countries to work jobs that would generate incomes that would be sent back to
Mhm.
support the home economy.
Yeah.
Um,
So we could just call that a global reserve army of labor, right? That work?
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So in a way, and that's kind of what the global capitalist system, it sort of encourages that development, right? Because it's really this idea of like winner takes all. I mean, if I go to, even in like, developing countries or, global south countries, and you go to, you know, like a local store and you open up the fridge and they have Coca-Cola, right?
Yeah.
And they're selling like
Yeah.
the global product, right?
Yeah.
And then the profits are going to the headquarters in Atlanta, in Georgia, right?
Yeah.
So and that's, yeah, I mean, so that like inequality regime is really grows out of capitalism. And then yeah, and then there's sort of this mistaken belief that, you can have economic globalization, uh, and at the same time you can have citizenship localism, you could say, right? Where you say, okay, I only give citizenship to the people that are born in my country, right? And but then I try to keep out as many other people as I can, right? Um, and that's like this perennial tension between the nation state, right? The demands of the nation state, for protecting its own citizens, versus the role that it takes within the, international economy. Um,
Mm.
and Yeah, so those tensions, I mean, they will continue to play out, right? I think that, we're not going to see a let up of those tensions.
That's through
And
decades. Yeah, definitely. We'll see what happens.
yeah, that's for sure. Okay, so
All
I
right.
think we'll
Call it
call the
quits.
podcast to an end.
All
So
right.
thank you much, Mike, for being here.